Hey guys, tonight we begin with the soft glow of an 18th century candle workshop, where beeswax logs meet linen wicks in a hush of curious ritual. Picture apprentices drifting between mugs of simmering wax, snipping wicks to just the right length and scribbling down every flicker. Intrigued? If you truly enjoy these whispered wanderings, consider hitting like and subscribe, only if it feels right. Share your location and local time in the comments so we can light this journey together across the globe. Before we drift deeper, dim your lights, turn on a gentle fan, and settle into your coziest spot. In a moment, we'll edge closer to that cozy hearth aroma and the faint drip of molten wax. Let anticipation flicker softly in your mind. Now the story begins. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and focus on the tale. Soon you will drift into restful slumber. The screen now fades to darkness. Before the first pale touch of dawn brushed the sky, the workshop lay in a hush that carried both promise and reverence. A single apprentice knelt before the hearth, its smoldering embers faintly glowing in the chill of earliest morning. He lifted a long-handled iron rake and, with deliberate care, coaxed the hot coals inward, teasing life from ash and charcoal. The stones around the fireplace, darkened by centuries of soot and flicker, held the memory of every candle melted, poured, and tested within these walls. Outside, in the gray half-light, the shapes of carts and bundled hides waited in silence. Each pale silhouette promised new deliveries of tallow or beeswax, but for now the world remained still, as if unwilling to stir too soon and disturb the workshop's slow awakening. From somewhere beyond the curtained door, the faint echo of distant church bells rose in measured tolls, marking the hour with a gentle insistence. Inside, the apprentice's breath came in quiet wisps, mingling with drifting smoke that hovered like an old friend reluctant to depart. He paused, setting the rake aside, and reached for a small steel poker. With soft taps, he encouraged the coals to shift, longing for an even, amber glow. The hearth began to hum with warmth, and the shadows danced briefly before receding into the corners. In that soft radiance, the apprentice glimpsed the polished brass of an oil lamp perched on a stone ledge. Its glass reservoir was dimmed by dust, its wick long since used. Today, it would burn anew, and in its golden circle the day's work would begin. Drawing a linen cloth from the bench, the apprentice unfolded it with reverence. He wiped each curve of the lamp, its slender spout, its rounded base, until the brass gleamed softly, muted under the low light. Then he unscrewed a tiny cap and reached for a vial of clear, fragrant oil. He poured it with steady hands, listening as the liquid hissed against the cool metal. The scent of grease and cedarwood drifted upward, a faint promise of burning warmth to come. Carefully, he trimmed the wick to the perfect length, no more than an inch, so that its flame would neither smoke nor falter. Striking a flint with iron, he summoned a spark and guided it to the waiting wick. Immediately, a slender yellow flame sprang to life, breathing light into the workshop's corners and banishing the last trembling shadows. Now, with the hearth and lamp alight, the apprentice rose and moved toward a rough-hewn oak bench that served as the altar of his craft. Along its surface lay the morning's tools, a set of snips for precise trimming, spoons of varying capacity for measured wax, and a neat row of thin molds, each bearing the marks of yesterday's experiments. The snips, small, curved, and keen, rested beside a shallow spoil basket woven from willow, ready to receive every trimmed wick and wax shaving. Next to them, 2 copper spoons shone with recent polishing, one held the faint residue of dried beeswax, the other was newly scrubbed for fresh trials. The molds, cast in tin and stamped with the workshop's brand, stood in patient alignment. Their interiors were cold to the touch, and the apprentice's fingertips detected the fine ridges where wax would nestle and then be released without mar. Each tool was arranged with thoughtful symmetry, as though their order might guide the day's unfolding. A soft tapping sounded at the door, 2 knocks, deliberate and calm. Another apprentice entered, cloaked in wool and carrying a small bundle of straw for the hearth. He bowed his head in greeting, mindful not to break the morning's stillness. Quietly, he placed the straw beside the existing stack, careful to maintain enough airflow through the hearth grate. The first apprentice nodded, accepting the offering as if it were the dawn itself. Together, they watched as the new tinder caught the glow of old coals, and the hearth surged in brightness. Flames leapt higher, transforming the workshop from a place of shadows into a cradle of warm light. As the fire settled into its steady rhythm, the two apprentices exchanged no words. In this early hour, speech would have broken the spell. Instead, they turned their attention to the brass lamp, ensuring its flame remained true and unchoked. A bead of condensation formed on the glass chimney from the heat difference, and one apprentice took a soft cloth to dab it away, revealing the dancing flicker within. The lamp's amber ring reached outward, inspecting every nook, beneath the bench, along the edges of a low shelf piled with notebooks, and across the rough stone floor where stray glimmers of dew collected in low spots. Out the window, the sky deepened from midnight blue to a slate gray. The world beyond held faint promises of movement, a team of horses stirring in a stable yard, a messenger making his way past shuttered storefronts. Here, within these walls, the apprentices prepared for a different journey. Their daily ritual would track the life of wax and wick in measured increments, the drip of molten beeswax, the rise and fall of every flame, the whisper of burnt wick fibers as they surrendered to flame or were clipped away. But before any candle would glow, before any record would be made, the morning's first duty lay in this quiet communion with hearth and lamp and tool. The air, warmed by the hearth and fragrant with oil and faint tallow, carried a soft resonance. Footfalls on the straw-strewn floor sounded muffled, yet unmistakably alive. A gentle creak of the wooden door warned when a third apprentice tiptoed in, bearing the note-filled ledger that would soon capture the day's experiments. The ledger's leather binding was supple and worn, each crease a testament to years of careful record-keeping. Today's page lay open, ready for quill and ink to record flame heights measured in millimeters, smoke levels noted in descriptive whispers. But first, the hearth must be tended, the lamp trimmed, the tools gathered. In the hush before sunrise, the simple acts of stirring coals, lighting oil, and arranging implements felt sacred. Each motion was repeated so often that the apprentices performed it without thought, yet each repetition was new, alive with subtle difference. The amber glow on the iron tools might catch a fleck of soot from yesterday's trials, altering its hue by the slimmest margin. The flame's breath against the mantle required a fraction more oil, or a slight turn of the wick, to hold perfectly steady. It was in these nuances that the workshop's true purpose revealed itself, a realm where observation and patience entwined, and the everyday candle, so easily taken for granted, was rendered extraordinary through methodical attention. As the first threads of dawn edged the sky beyond the small, mullioned window, the apprentices paused. The hearth burned evenly, the lamp cast a comforting pool of light, and each tool stood at attention on the bench. They exchanged a glance, not of conversation but of shared understanding. In moments, the master of the workshop would arrive, his footsteps heralded by the morning bells. Then, the day's full procession would commence, waxes stirred and tested, wicks trimmed and sampled, candles judged and recorded. Yet for now, in this pre-dawn embered stillness, time itself seemed to lag, as though honoring the slow birth of light and heat. The hush deepened, and with it, the apprentices, lantern in hand and hearts attuned, prepared to greet the day's quiet rituals. A low bell tolled through the misty morning air, its clear note drifting across the half-dormant town and into the thick stone walls of the candle workshop. Within, the air was cool and heavy with the faint scent of charcoal that still clung to the hearth from before dawn. A single apprentice, already on his knees among the scattered straw on the floor, paused in his sweeping to listen. Then, once, twice, the bell resounded again, and he rose, brushing his hands on the coarse wool of his sleeve as he prepared to greet the day. Footsteps followed the bell's summons. Soft thuds on the straw, the shuffle of leather soles, a sliding of great wooden doors as they opened against wrought iron hinges. The courtyard outside would still have been gray with lingering fog, but inside the threshold, warmth already began to spread. From the hearth in the far corner, embers glowed amber through blackened coals, and above it a copper kettle exhaled a wispy steam. The master candlemaker stepped forward, lantern in hand, his heavy cloak brushing the straw. 2 apprentices trailed behind him, each carrying a small bundle of fresh linen cloths and a rough-hewn box of tools. As the workshop's doors swung fully open, a hush fell for a moment, broken only by the quiet creak of floorboards. The master set down his lantern on a low bench, its glass chimney catching the first bit of light that filtered through frost-rimed windows. He lifted the kettle's lid and checked the water with a practiced eye, then nodded to one of the apprentices. That boy hurried to add a handful of coal to the hearth, retrieving it from a side bin with gloved hands. Sparks popped as the coal settled into the red coals, and the tiny flames flickered, casting dancing shadows among the racks of molds and tins. The second apprentice moved to unlatch the well-worn wooden lids of 2 large barrels set against the far wall. One contained sweet-smelling beeswax logs, pale as candlelight itself, each block scored with parallel lines to guide clean breaks. The other barrel held dense, grayish-white tallow chunks, heavy and compact, nicked by countless wedges of the master's knife. He lifted the lid and inhaled deeply, letting the faintest hint of honeyed wax tide him forward. He called softly, "Master, the wax and tallow are ready." A warm murmur of greeting rose from the bench where the master was already laying out spoons, snips, and spoils baskets. Around them, the hearth's glow crept upward, touching the stone walls and revealing the grain in the beams overhead. At the main workbench, the oaken slab scarred by years of repeated drips, a third apprentice knelt to brush straw away, settling burlap-swathed boxes of powdered additives into neat rows. Each jar was labeled in tidy copperplate, crushed alum, chalky whiting, even a container of powdered rosin that lent stiffness to the finished candles. Next to them, bundles of linen wicks lay coiled in thin hanks, their ends tied with slender threads. A smaller stack of pale, papery rush wicks awaited trial as well. All were fashioned days before, pulled through hot water and waxed to ensure consistency, then hung to dry under the eaves. While these preparations continued, 2 other apprentices approached the window panes, where overnight frost had settled into a delicate filigree of ice. Each pressed a rag of coarse linen to the glass, wiping away the condensation and revealing the first pale shafts of dawn beyond. The world outside remained a blur of gray, rooftops glistened with dew. Within, the light shifted imperceptibly, softening the lantern's glow until the 2 melded into a single, diffused warmth. The apprentices paused, leaning a moment against the sill, watching their breaths cloud in the rising warmth of the room. The master watched all this with quiet satisfaction. He paused at the hearth, swept a metal poker through the embers, and glanced at the copper kettle. Steam curled in lazy spirals. He turned and beckoned the apprentices back to the benches. One by one, they resumed their stations, settling on low stools carved from oak. The first boy at the east bench lifted a slate of beeswax, running both palms over its surface to gauge its yield point, the soft give of the wax under gentle pressure. He listened for the faint crackle that meant tiny air pockets lay within. Another apprentice selected a block of tallow and tapped it with a small mallet to test its compactness. Each knock echoed softly, a measured inquiry into the substance's readiness. In the quiet that followed, the master spoke in a voice no louder than the bell's last toll. "Let us begin," he said, and pointed toward a rack of spoons perched over a brazier filled with glowing coals. A lad stepped forward and carried the brass ladle across the floor, its handle warm under his touch. He dipped it into a small melting pot, stirring the beeswax ribbons that sank slowly into liquid gold. The wax glowed like honey in the dim light, and as he lifted the ladle, droplets fell back into the pool with a soft plop. From the central bench came the soft snip of wick scissors. A slender linen wick was trimmed to 6 millimeters, no more, no less, its end squared off cleanly. The apprentice held it between his fingertips, then set it aside on a piece of driftwood to rest. Nearby, ribbons of wax cooled on a scrap of pewter, forming delicate, crystalline edges that he would later mill for reblending. The master moved from bench to bench, observing each step with a tranquil authority, his footfalls muffled by the scattered straw. As the liquid wax pooled in each ladle, apprentices aligned slender tin molds along sand-filled trays. Corners of canvas cloth fluttered as a faint draft stirred the workroom air. One student carefully poured wax into the first mold, watching the spiral swirl down without forming air bubbles. A gloved hand tapped the side of the mold to coax any errant pocket of air upward, and the wax settled with a gentle sigh. When it reached the brim, the apprentice paused, drawing the ladle away in slow motion to capture the last viscous drop that clung to its edge. All the while, a soft chorus of murmured observations filled the air. 5 minutes and flame held steady. Tiny smoke ring at the 6th minute. Each note was recorded later, but in this moment, they spoke their results aloud, a communal litany that bound them to the craft. The master nodded at each report, sometimes offering a word of guidance, sometimes simply remaining silent, his gaze steady as the spreading warmth reached every corner of the room. By then, the windows were clear, and the dawn light grew firmer. Through the glass, rooftops took on color, slate grays and muted browns, the promise of a sun yet to rise. Inside, the brisk chill had given way to a gentle warmth that rose from the hearth and the smoldering pots. The air smelled of honeyed wax and coal smoke, striped with the faint mineral tang of whiting dust. Each breath felt deliberate and calm, as though time itself complied with the slow rhythm of this place. The master raised his lantern for a moment, letting its small flame flicker beside the warming hearthfire. Today, he said softly, we awaken not just this workshop, but every home that will one day rely on our candles. Let us proceed with care. His words were not grand, but carried a weight that settled over the apprentices like a benediction. They bent toward their tasks once more, repeating motions practiced many times before, dipping, trimming, observing, and noting. And so, at the first light of day, the workshop roused itself fully alive. Each apprentice moved with quiet purpose, each tool sang its subtle note, and the master guided them with the patience of one who knew that in this quiet ritual lay the simple kindling of every hearth and every evening to come. The hour passed softly, measured by gentle drips of molten wax and the hush of careful observation, setting the stage for the precise inspection of wicks and wax blocks that would follow in the next chapter. In this awakening, the seed of illumination was planted, and each deliberate step whispered of the steady glow that awaited the world beyond these stone walls. A pale mist clung to the courtyard as the apprentices entered the workshop on this third dawn of their week-long candle trials. In the dim gray of early morning, only the hearth's embers and a single coal lamp glowed, casting gentle shadows on the rough-hewn shelves. There, stacked against the cold stone wall, lay the day's materials, blocks of beeswax, hewn from golden comb, dense squares of tallow, smudged at the edges by handling, and bundles of wicks, spun from linen or woven from rush fibers. The air carried a promise of quiet labor, and, for a few moments, the world outside slowed to match the hush within these walls. Master Pharaoh moved with deliberate calm, nodding toward the wax blocks. His voice, low and steady, guided the apprentices into today's essential ritual. We begin by knowing our raw materials as intimately as our own hands, he said. Each block speaks of its origin, the season of the hive, the breed of the sheep, the care taken in spinning the fibers. Attend to every nuance. Let your senses record what your ledger will later confirm. An apprentice knelt beside a pale yellow block of beeswax. With fingers brushed clean of soot and stray wax flakes, she traced the surface, noting its faint ridges and the pattern of tiny creases where it had cooled in its oak crate. The beeswax yielded slightly beneath her touch, a tender warmth that spoke of spring's first bloom. She inhaled gently. A sweetness, almost floral, hovered at the back of her throat, the distant scent of linden blossoms carried on a summer breeze, a hum of nectar and pollen distilled into solid form. Across the bench, another apprentice lifted a square of tallow. Its color was deeper, almost oyster gray, flecked with tiny crystals that glinted where light caught them. He tapped the edge with a callous thumbnail. The sound was a soft, dull knock, heartier than the ring of beeswax, and a reminder that this block would burn differently, with a heavier smoke and a warmer glow. Leaning closer, he inhaled the tallow's more subdued aroma, rich, faintly meaty, trailing a whisper of the stables where cattle were kept, of sun-baked fields and the animals' heavy breath. In the quiet that followed, the two apprentices exchanged a glance. There was no need for words, they shared an understanding that these subtle differences would shape every flicker of flame to come. Master Pharaoh watched them, his eyes gentle yet exacting, impelling them to notice even the faintest echo of scent or sound. Next came the wicks. Bundles bound with slender hemp cord lay in neat rows on the bench's worn surface. By lamplight they looked much the same, pale threads twisted around one another, the linen fibers almost gleaming, the rush darkening to a mottled tan. But close inspection revealed minute divergences. One bundle of linen wicks carried a barely perceptible gloss, as if the fibers had been lightly oiled or starched. Another, looser in its twist, promised a softer draw of melted wax but risked sagging within the candle's core. The rush wicks felt coarser to the touch, their rigidity hinting at a steadier flame but perhaps a sharper smoke if left too long. Apprentices counted each bundle in turn, their fingers slender and sure. One by one, they noted the number of twirls in each length, 9 twists here, 11 twists there, and recorded these counts in the margin of a folded scrap of parchment. Master Pharaoh had insisted they observe these small distinctions, for within them lay the secret to a candle that neither flickered nor choked its bearer in a swirl of black soot. As the counting concluded, the apprentices separated the wicks into 3 small groups. The finer linen threads were set aside for the beeswax samples, where a gentle wick could coax the honeyed wax into a steady, clear glow. The sturdier rush wicks would partner with tallow, warding off its heavier soot with unwavering rigidity. A third, mixed set would be kept in reserve, to pair with blended waxes in the trials that would follow. Each bundle was tied anew with soft hemp cord, a knot at precisely the same point on every length, ensuring uniformity when the strands were finally trimmed. With the wicks chosen, attention returned to the wax. Apprentices weighed each block on a small brass scale, careful to note the balance of ounces against the counterweight of polished lead. Master Pharaoh's ledger lay open at the bench's edge, its margins already crowded with observations from the first 2 mornings. Into it they copied the measured weights, the scents, the textures. Each entry was made by the lamplight, the quill's tip dipping into deep brown ink that pooled momentarily on the parchment before feathering into the fiber beneath. The quiet ritual unfolded almost ceremonially. The soft rustle of paper as wicks were wrapped, the gentle tap of wax blocks on the stone floor, the murmur of breath as a line was drawn beneath a fresh entry, all these sounds blended into a symphony of deliberate calm. Even the stray creak of the workshop door, as a breeze nudged it ajar, took on a gentle quality, like a whispered invitation to deeper focus. Once the blocks were weighed and the wicks accounted for, Master Pharaoh signaled for a pause. He stepped forward, his boots brushing straw aside as he moved between the benches, inspecting each apprentice's work. He pressed a fingertip to the surface of a beeswax block, turned it over in his hand, then guided the apprentice's own hand to feel the firmness of the tallow square. "Good," he said softly. "You sense the slight give of beeswax and the resilience of tallow. You hear the tap and feel how it echoes. Tomorrow, these differences will guide us in the melting pots, in the selection of spoons, in the very rhythm of drip and ladle." At his words, the apprentices bowed their heads, aware for a moment of the day's impending tasks, the melting, the stirring, the molds waiting in the corner of the hearth. But for now, they remained here, lingering over the subtle fragrance of wax, the texture of twisted fibers, the gentle scratch of tallied quill across parchment. As the lamp's flame steadied, Master Pharaoh gathered the chosen wicks and placed them near the hearth's warmth, preparing them to soften slightly, to lay more pliant within the wax when the trials began. The wax blocks, too, were stacked by size and weight, ordered for the first melts at dawn. Apprentices wound their quills into the folds of their coats, brushed stray shavings from their sleeves, and inhaled once more those layered scents, honeyed pollen, farmyard earth, hemp and linen, all bound together by the faint tang of metal and ink. In these moments of stillness, the workshop seemed to breathe as one, a living space of stone and wood, wax and fiber, flame and ink. Each apprentice felt the pulse of centuries past, of candlemakers who had come before, of manuals penned by candlelight and diaries that meticulously noted every flicker. Chapter by chapter, ember by ember, they were now adding their own quiet verse to that unbroken tradition. When Master Pharaoh finally spoke again, it was with a gentle inclination of his head. "Tomorrow we begin the first melt," he reminded them. "We shall coax these blocks into liquid form and observe how our chosen wicks draw that liquid to flame. Until then, rest your senses and prepare your minds for the slow pulse of fire. The craft demands patience, and in its patience lies its reward." With those words, the apprentices rose, each lingering for an instant beside the bench where wax and wicks lay organized. The lamp burned on, casting its steady glow across the stone floor. Outside, the world still slept in mist and shadow, but inside this quiet workshop, a soft promise hung in the air, a promise of gentle glows yet to come, of dripping wax, of measured flames, and of the unhurried magic that would unfold when dawn returned. The ritual was only just beginning. A thin veil of smoke still hovered in the wide stone room as the apprentices gathered around the hearth for the day's first great act, the gentle transformation of solid wax into a golden, flowing liquid. In Chapter 1, dawn's embers were coaxed back to life. In Chapter 2, the workshop awakened to the murmur of arriving hands, and in Chapter 3, the pale beeswax blocks and dusky tallow logs were handled, examined, and selected. Now, in this quiet heart of the day, the master and his apprentices moved with deliberate care, each gesture a rehearsal in patience and precision. The hearth's coals, stoked to a bright glow, cast wavering amber reflections on rough oak beams overhead. A polished copper pot, darkened by years of gentle flame, was placed directly upon the iron grate. One apprentice knelt, placing a small pile of neatly trimmed beeswax ribbons into the waiting vessel. Each ribbon, about the length of a forefinger, snapped against calloused palms with a crisp, delicate note before sliding into the warming metal bowl. The soft crackle as the first ribbons met the hot surface sounded like distant rain on tin roof. Gently, the apprentice inched the ladle forward to test the heat, its silver bowl glowing a faint blush in the hearthlight. From across the bench, another apprentice handed over a small parchment packet of powdered resin, a measured blend of pine pitch and crushed bees propolis, ground to the fineness of talc. The sealed packet bore an inked sigil, a reminder that each additive influenced scent, hardness, and flame stability in tiny, critical degrees. With a steady hand, the master tipped the copper pot so that the slowly melting ribbons clung to one side. Within moments, they began to dissolve, thin rivulets of warm wax coursing together like honey shaken from the comb. The surface rippled gently, and tiny bubbles gathered where the metal was hottest. Apprentices watched with quiet concentration, counting the seconds in their mind to ensure an even dissolve. It was here, in this hushed interlude, that the true alchemy of candle testing commenced. No greater haste was permitted than the very slow pace of wax softening. Every apprentice held a slip of parchment on which to note the moment when the last fragment of solid wax vanished beneath the molten tide. Quills were raised halfway from ink wells, prepared to record, first fluidity noted, 27.5 minutes past 8. Such precision, though seemingly trivial, shaped every home's light for the months ahead. When the pot brimmed with pearlescent liquid, the master withdrew the ladle for examination. A single drop, falling slowly onto a nearby slate tile, cooled at once into a glassy bead. The apprentice who had stirred counted aloud, in a hushed voice, 1, 2, 3, until the bead had solidified enough to test its hardness with a fingernail. The faint tink of metal on cool wax signaled readiness for the next stage. Now came the careful measure of powdered additives. A small balance beam scale was placed on the bench, 2 copper pans leveled by frictionless pivots. Into one pan went exact spoonfuls of white pearl ash, meant to stiffen the wax and reduce smoking, while in the other balanced a selection of perfumed chips, lavender blossoms crushed fine, and a whisper of rose attar. Each half-grain weight shift was noted. The apprentices watched the beat of the pan until perfect equilibrium, then gently tapped the scale to settle the powders together. With the master's nod, the hot, rippled wax was poured back into the empty pan, enveloping the powders in a brief swirl of steam and softened petals. A sudden sweet hint of lavender drifted upward against the tang of heated metal. Apprentices leaned forward, as if seeking to decode in the scent whether the mixture would yield the ideal burn. Then, as the powders dissolved into the liquid mass, minute impurities, tiny specks of trapped air, minute flecks of leftover bark from the resin, rose to the surface. The master lifted his slender silver ladle and, with the lightest touch, skimmed each imperfection into a waiting bowl. The scraped detritus hissed as it landed, the faintest sizzle muffled by straw-softened floors. No one spoke, the only sound the delicate metallic whisper of purification. When the surface of the pot shone, unblemished and clear, the master signaled the apprentice who held the book of measurements. With ink already damp on the quill, he inscribed a single entry: batch alpha, 75% beeswax, 15% tallow, 10% resin, pearl ash 0.8 grain, lavender essence 1.2 grain. Fluid at 70 degrees. Below, an apprentice sketched a tiny diagram of the pot, annotated with margin notes about the wax's clarity and aroma. The quiet ceremony continued, moment by moment. A second copper pot took the stage, this time for the tallow blend, dark, earthy, and more prone to smoke. The apprentices poured measured shavings of tallow into the bowl, their fingers brushing the compartment of a wooden box that held a variety of wick samples. A linen wick, thicker and more absorbent, was chosen to match the heavier wax. Another thin rush fiber wick was reserved, if only to be tested against the master blend later. Again, ribbons of wax met flame, dripped to liquid, and coalesced into a molten sea. A fresh sprinkling of powdered chalk, added to raise the melting point just enough to prevent too soft candles on warm nights, was measured with the same serene exactness. Each pupil exhaled softly as they watched the powder whirl into the glow. As the second pot reached its proper fluidity, the apprentices stepped back to observe. The two liquids, one pale honey, the other soft cream, were ladled side by side onto a silver tray. The master dipped each wick into its complementary wax, rotating slowly so that every fiber core was bathed. Then, with gentle motions, he laid each prepared wick onto fresh strips of parchment lined on the bench. These, primed, wicks would rest until cooled, serving as the first test pieces in tomorrow's candle ignitions. Tonight's chapter would close with the quiet setting aside of these strips, each one a promise of flame and warmth, before the hearth was banked and darkness reclaimed the workshop. But for now, as the last ribbon dissolved and the final impurity was skimmed away, the room lay in suspended wonder. Only the hearth's glow and the copper pot's soft reflections remained to witness the alchemy of soft wax made liquid, the ritual that would shape every flicker of light in parlors, studies, and taverns across the countryside. The first melt complete, the path to tomorrow's trials shimmered before them, a gentle river of molten gold and cream, waiting to be molded. In the gentle glow that fills the workshop at mid-morning, an unhurried hush settles over the benches as the master and apprentices prepare to mold the day's first trials. The air, still warm from the hearth's steady blaze, carries a soft hum of anticipation. Here, simplicity is close to sacred. Tin molds, each slender and purposeful, stand ready on low wooden trays half filled with fine, pale sand. The sand's surface is leveled to a milky smoothness, save for the faint trail left by a fingertip when the master tests its evenness one last time. Each mold will capture a shape, a small promise of light, and every careful pour writes a silent chapter in this long ritual. At a rough-hewn bench near the hearth's amber glow, the apprentices assemble the tins one by one. Their hands move slowly, deliberately. The tins, cool and slightly rough to the touch, are lifted from a varnished oak rack. Each is inspected, a gentle tap against the palm reveals minute dents or irregularities, any flaw that might trap air or mar the candle's surface. Satisfied, the apprentices press the rings of tin into the sand, spacing them at even intervals. The master kneels beside the tray, squinting in the warm light, and nods, as though tasting the moment itself. A single bead of sweat, heavy in the quiet, drips down the apprentice's temple. No word is spoken, none is needed. With the tin settled, the next step is to pour the liquefied wax. The copper kettle, still brimful with the honeyed melt from the morning's heating, sits above the hearth flames. The apprentice lifts it by the hooked handle, feeling the kettle's heat through a protective cloth wound carefully about their forearm. The wax inside shimmers like molten gold, rippling with every slight tilt. Long breaths steady the apprentice's hand as the kettle is carried forward, the gentle crackle of embers rising in soft rhythm. Each movement is measured against the workshop's hush, each shift in posture marked by the nearly imperceptible creak of floorboards beneath straw that cushions and warms the stone floor. Then comes the moment of pouring. The apprentice lowers the spout of the kettle to the rim of the first tin mold. A thin ribbon of wax begins to flow, slow, controlled, as if reluctant to part from its vessel. The pour is not a single rush but a steady spiral, the kettle's lip swirling close to the tin's edge, guiding the molten stream in concentric circles. This spiral ensures any trapped air escapes, coaxed upward by the circular motion, popping softly at the surface with tiny pinpricks of steam. The thread of wax grows thicker as the mold fills, the spiral widening gently until the tin stands brimming with liquid light. A minuscule wisp of fragrance rises, the wax warmed enough that whispers of trace acacia honey and the faint, resinous memory of pine mingle with the hearth's smokiness. When the first mold is full, the apprentice lifts the kettle and shifts to the next. Each pour echoes the first in careful grace, slow spiral, steady ribbon, rising cloud of warmth. The apprentices work in unison, the master's eyes observing the flow, the height of the pour, the moment each mold reaches its brim. If a ripple disturbs the sand, or if a stray bead of wax lands upon the tray, a gentle tap of the spoon's handle sets things aright. No candle may emerge with an air pocket or an uneven crown. Overfilling is trimmed back with a slender, flat-bladed scraper, the excess peeled away in delicate layers and returned to the melting kettle where it will blend again with fresh wax. The spacing between tins is more than mere measurement, it is an act of balance. The apprentices adjust each mold millimeter by millimeter, ensuring that neighboring molds do not draw heat from one another too rapidly or too slowly. Too close, and the wax may meld at the rims before cooling evenly, too far, and drafts may chill the metal unevenly, causing cracks or uneven walls. The master uses a wooden ruler, nicked from countless prior days, to gauge the distance with quiet precision, his fingertips brushing over each tin's rim as though reading the grain of a manuscript. With a final nod, he steps back, his shoulders uncoiling in satisfaction. As the last kettle empties, the apprentices set it aside. They exchange faint, relieved smiles, though their faces remain composed in deference to the workshop's solemnity. Softly, they reach for slender wicks, linen strands carefully twisted, and press their bases against the center of each mold, ensuring they stand upright once the wax has cooled enough to hold them. This delicate planting is done before the wax has fully set but after it has thickened enough that the wicks will remain straight. Each wick is a narrow promise, a guide for the flame that will later test these trials. The wick's surface, slightly lustrous, holds a trace of sizing, a thin coating of water-based starch that helps it feed the flame in a clean, measured manner. Once all wicks are aligned, and the molds sit like rows of patient pilgrims, the apprentices retreat to wash their hands. The workshop, for a few moments, reverts to calm expectation. Overhead, a beam of mid-morning light spills through the smoke-frosted window, illuminating the molds in quiet halos. The workshop's stillness carries the faint scent of beeswax, of oiled leather, and the comforting tang of warmed metal. In this pause, the apprentices breathe deep and watch the wax's surface shift from molten sheen to a dawn of milky opacity. Soon, the master will inspect each mold, running a slender metal probe around the rims to detect any early signs of contraction or cracking. But for now, the workshop stands hushed, a cathedral of light in the making. Each mold holds within it both hope and data, the hope of a flawless candle, and the data of wax composition, heat ratio, and wick behavior ready to be measured and logged once the candles emerge. This slow, deliberate molding is both beginning and middle ground, connecting the morning's melting and the afternoon's rigorous testing that will follow. As the sun climbs higher beyond the glass panes, the sand around the tins cools to a gentle warmth, and the wax inside settles in its new form. The apprentice glances at the master, who nods almost imperceptibly. It is a gesture that marks success in patience, precision, and attentiveness, a silent commendation before the day moves on. In these moments of waiting, the workshop's rhythm feels elemental, almost timeless, heat meeting metal, wax meeting wick, light waiting to be born. And though no flame yet flickers within these molds, each one holds the promise of quiet radiance, destined to glow in parlors, in taverns, and in the solitary hands of letter writers when dusk falls. Thus ends the molding of the day's trials, and thus begins the next quiet ritual, when the candles emerge, trimmed and lit, to reveal and flicker and smoke the fruits of this exacting labor. A pale shaft of dawn light slips through the workshop's high, narrow windows, painting the cold stone floor in gentle bands of gold. The air still carries the faint warmth of yesterday's hearth fire, now reduced to glowing embers in the back alcove. Apprentices move quietly among benches, their footsteps muffled on straw and wood shavings. On one long oak plank lie the candles poured and cooled after the last trial of molding. Each slender column, uniform in girth and hue, awaits its moment beneath the amber glow of a single oil lamp. Today, these tapers will be ignited for the first time, an intimate ritual of slow observation, hushed note-taking, and subtle judgment. At the center of the bench rests a small wooden jig, carved long ago to cradle a candle upright and steady. Alongside it, a pair of fine blades, wick scissors, gleam in the soft lamplight. The master instructs the apprentices to work in pairs, one to hold the candle, the other to trim the wick. Each wick must measure precisely 6 mm from the tip of the taper's wax shoulder to the charred end. Too long, and the flame will flicker and smoke; too short, and the wax pool may fail to draw sufficiently, risking tunnel burn. An apprentice extracts the first candle from its row. The wax, pale as ivory, feels cool and hard to the touch. He places it upright in the jig. A second apprentice brings forward a slender ruler of polished bone, marked in tiny increments. Carefully, she positions it against the wick, sliding the tip until precisely 6 mm register. Fingers poised, she hands the candle to her partner. The pair exchange a silent nod, the only sound the faint rasp of cloth against wood. With a deliberate motion, she brings the sharp blades to the wick. A single quiet snip breaks the stillness. The clipped wick falls, landing soft and black on the bench, a tiny fragment of charred fiber. The apprentice clasps it in his fingers for a moment, noting its neat cut and lack of fraying, then lays it into a small spoil basket at his feet. Each discarded wick promises smoother burn and clearer record-keeping. He lifts the candle from the jig and arranges it among its untrimmed siblings, each now bearing its precisely measured wick. Around them, the workshop is hushed. A faint fragrance of beeswax mingles with the earthy scent of tallow, while faint puffed echoes of church bells drift in from the village church tower. A lone apprentice, stationed by the hearth, tends the coals beneath a shallow crucible, coaxing up a smoldering ember on a length of iron. That whisper of fire will serve as their igniting source, for a lamp flame might impart too sudden a heat. The ritual demands patience, a glowing ember must kiss the wick's tip gently, coaxing it to flame rather than singe. The first candle stands ready. A slender rod of iron extends from the hearth, holding a small patch of glowing coal at its end. The apprentice responsible for ignition approaches with measured steps. All eyes follow his movement, watching the ember's dull red glow pass from hearth to bench. He lowers the coal to the wick's tip and holds it for a quiet moment. A delicate plume of smoke curls upward, twining in the morning light. Then, with a soft eruptive flicker, an amber flame appears, small and bright. The master leans forward, peering closely. The flame rises with a gentle curve, reaching upward in a slender teardrop shape. Its color is warm honey, tinged with pale blue at the base where heat draws the melting wax into the wick's core. Apprentices record nothing yet, this is an observation to imprint in memory, a first communion of flame and form. The candle's glow begins to radiate outward, a circle of muted gold upon the bench and the apprentice's gauntlet fingers. After 2 minutes, the master indicates with a slight nod that the apprentice may light the next candle. One by one, 6 tapers have their wicks trimmed and embers coaxed until the bench transforms into a small constellation of dancing lights. Each flame has its own character, one flickers with a shy wavering, as though stirred by an invisible breath, another glows serenely, unwavering, a third offers a subtle tremor, its form slimmer and more elusive. The smoke trails vary, too, some rise straight, ghostly and pale, while others form gentle spirals that dissipate quickly. The apprentices cluster around in pairs again. One whispers under her breath, "Candle 3 shows a faint soot line already." The other replies, "Its wick may be over-twisted. Note that in the ledger." They exchange soft glances, careful to keep their voices low, preserving the workshop's contemplative hush. The master lifts one finger, asking for silence, then points to the third candle. He signals the apprentice with the scrap of trimmed wick to carry the remaining soot deposit to the corner brazier, where the spent chippings of earlier experiments melt away in a slow crimson pool. The ritual proceeds at this deliberate pace. For each candle, flame height is judged, measured by sight against the chipped windowpanes Muntin as a reference, while wavering motion is counted by a silent tap of knuckle, one flicker every so many beats. The smoke's density is felt by breathing in from a cautious distance, noting any acrid note that hints at incomplete combustion. In this workshop, these nuances matter. Small variations in wick twist, wax purity, or additive proportions manifest in these first ignitions. Here, at the moment of flame, the day's earliest truths emerge. With half the candles tested, the apprentices pause to snuff each flame using a slender metal spatula, pinching gently at the wick to choke off air. The extinguished wicks hiss softly, curling in on themselves under the weight of heat's sudden absence. Amber embers flicker within the core for a heartbeat before sinking back into charcoal. The spent candles are carried away to a side shelf, destined for the ledger room where their performance will be noted in ink by lamplight. As the master surveys the half-dozen embers now dim, he gathers the apprentices in a semicircle. His voice, calm and low, speaks of the subtle differences he noted, one flame leaning eastward as if drawn by a draft, another refusing to burn past 6 minutes before flickering irregularly. He reminds them that each test must be recorded, that tomorrow's mid-morning supply check and the afternoon trials depend on the clarity of these first observations. The morning ritual concludes with a shared exhale. The apprentices step back, removing their tools from the bench. The hearth keeper leans over and stirs the coals, preparing for the broil to come. Candles awaiting testing stand in neat rows, some still unlit, some already blackened at the tips. In the distance, the day beyond the workshop stirs to life, the market square preparing for customers, the baker's oven beginning to glow. Within these stone walls, however, time slows to the flicker of small flames, each a quiet testament to the subtle alchemy of wax, wick, and fire. Thus does the morning's candle ignition close, seamless in its hush and exacting in its care. Already the next chapter of this day's trials beckons, ledgers to fill by hearthlight, supplies to fetch, variations to perfect. But for now, a calm satisfaction settles over the bench, and the faint scent of warming wax lingers, promising discoveries yet to come. The lads settle in a quiet semicircle around the long oak bench, its rough grain catching the soft flicker of the hearth. Dawn's pale light has waned now, only the warm glow of half a dozen test tapers fights the lingering chill. On the bench rests a heavy-bound ledger, its cover a patchwork of dark leather and brass clasps dulled by years of gentle handling. Apprentices exchange furtive glances, each one mindful that these early entries will chart the course of every trial to come. The master moves among them with deliberate calm, stirring the embers in the hearth before sinking into his stool. The air is scented with beeswax and iron-wrought ink, and not a breath stirs in the low-ceilinged room. A hush falls as the apprentices draw quills from their leather pouches. Each quill has been seasoned in hot sand overnight, hollowed and trimmed to a precise point. They dip the tips into shallow wells of sepia ink, watching the liquid climb the slender shaft in a narrow thread. The moment is ritualistic. When the nib is ready, it's tested with a quick scratch on a scrap of parchment, a thin whisper of sound, like silk brushing stone. Then each apprentice sets to work, leaning forward, eyes trained on the ledger's open page. The crackle of hearth logs fills the pauses, as if the old fire itself offers encouragement to the careful scribes. With unhurried attention, the apprentices inscribe the flame heights beside faint sketches of taper profiles. 5 inches steady amber glow, one writes, the quill's nib dancing lightly across the page. Another marks the slight lean of a candle as the wick curled inward at the 7-minute mark, sketching a delicate arc by way of explanation. The sound of quill on paper is soft yet certain, drowned only by the dull thump of wax shavings dropping into a basket. In each recorded line, sums and observations build a living tapestry of light, the curve of each flame, the whisper of its breath against still air, the slim plume of smoke that follows its every flicker. At their feet stands the spoil basket, a wooden vessel lined with dark cloth to mute the crackle of discarded wax. Apprentices crack off misshapen drips and brittle shavings, letting them fall with a muted patter as the basket fills. The pile of pale curls grows slowly, and each time a sliver of wax strikes the cloth, it makes a gentle puff of ash that drifts upward and quickly fades. There is something almost musical in the pattern, the periodic pat, the soft sigh of cloth, and the steady heartbeat of the hearth. Even the discarded wax seems to join the day's quiet ritual, offering its discarded insights to the small brazier at the corner, where seconds later it melts into forgetful warmth. The master moves closer to each apprentice in turn, bending to examine their entries. He regards the loops of script and the tiny, precise diagrams with a thoughtful silence. When his gaze rests upon a questionable notation, he offers a barely audible murmur, a gentle correction, delivered in a tone as soft as the drip of cooling wax. Not once does he raise his voice above a whisper. Each nod he gives is slow and steady, affirming a correctly noted flame height or subtle flicker. At moments he stretches a long finger to trace a line of ink, his touch deliberate, as though ensuring the apprentices truly feel the weight and importance of these first observations. Candles overhead tremble ever so slightly, shadows dancing across the stones beneath the bench. In the steady warmth of the hearth and the penumbral hush of the workshop, the ledger feels almost alive. Its pages, porous with ink yet crisp in their promise, stretch out as a testament to careful craft. The apprentices pause now and then to lean back, brushing wax smudges from fingertips, then lean forward again with fresh purpose. Ink wells are refilled, nibs are tested on the margin, and the soft scratch of the quill resumes, unbroken, like a tide rolling in over a silent shore. Each apprentice brings a personal touch to the task. One carefully curls stray parchment fibers from the ledger's spine before making his entry. Another taps her quill against the rim of the ink well to dislodge a lump of dried pigment, mindful that only a smooth flow of ink will preserve the clarity of tomorrow's reviews. In the hush, breathing becomes more deliberate. Every exhalation is measured, so as not to disturb the fragile flames. Even the master exhales softly, and for a moment, there is a shared rhythm among all, ink, flame, wax, and breath united in the quiet pursuit of perfect candlecraft. Time drifts without pressure. The sun climbs higher beyond the workshop windows, though only a diffused glow filters through the translucent glass. In the ledger, the first set of entries takes shape across 2 full pages, flame heights, burn durations, annotations of soot and shimmer. Already the apprentices sense patterns emerging, certain wicks yield steadier light, particular beeswax blends hold a brighter hue. Yet there is no haste in their recognition, no rush to judgment. Instead, they allow the ledger's stories to unfold gently, line by line, trusting the steady pace of their own hands. By the time the master lifts his head and announces a brief pause, the spoil basket is half full and the ledger rests on the bench, open to the day's earliest records. The apprentices rise and stretch, quietly smoothing their coats of beeswax dust. The master closes the ledger's cover with a muted click, as though sealing in the morning's discoveries. He sets it beside a lantern that will guard the pages until after midday, when new trials and fresh measurements will beckon. Then, with a final approving nod, he guides the apprentices toward the side shelf where fresh coal waits in neat stacks. Their next task, replenishing the hearth and sharpening wick scissors, stands ready. Thus the quiet ritual continues, each step woven into the unhurried tapestry of 19th-century light. The mid-morning sun had climbed just high enough to pierce the mottled glass of the workshop windows, touching each burning candle with a pale, diffused glow that mingled with the steady amber radiance of the hearth. The apprentices moved with deliberate calm, as though they were part of some grand, silent clockwork, each action measured, each sound understated yet comforting. The day's first trials continued their gentle crackle at the bench. Slender tapers stood upright in simple iron holders, their flames bobbing in a slow, unhurried rhythm. In this lull between observation sessions, the master signaled that it was time for the mid-morning supply check, a quiet ritual that ensured the afternoon's work would proceed as smoothly as the melted wax flowing from pot to mold. At one end of the workshop, by the hearth's low glow, an apprentice rose and slipped quietly across the straw-scattered floor toward a wrought iron door set into the thick stone wall. Beyond it lay a narrow alcove where sacks of coal, cut to uniform size and stacked in neat pyramids, waited under a thick wooden shelf. The apprentice crouched on one knee, fingers brushing the rough bag as he slipped aside the coarse cloth strap. The first lump of coal emerged, cool and slate-gray in the dim corner, each edge sharp enough to catch the light. He lifted the piece, its weight solid in his palm, and set it gently into a woven willow basket. The soft scrape of coal on wicker sounded like distant rain, a muted echo in the hush. He gathered 4 more lumps, each chosen for its density and lack of fissure, and carried them back across the workshop. At the hearth, the master nodded, dipping a long-tined iron fork into the coals, stirring ember and ash until a small blaze flared on the surface. With a practiced twist of his wrist, he deposited the fresh coal into the fire, watching as it hissed once and then glowed slowly into the ember bed. A faint wisp of smoke curled upward, carrying with it a sweet, woody perfume that drifted through the room and settled in the corners. Nearby, a second apprentice stood at a small oaken table where tools awaited. A pair of wick scissors lay upon a square of well-worn leather. These scissors, though unassuming, were among the most cherished instruments in the workshop, their blades honed so finely that they could slice a single linen fiber without friction. Today, they needed to be sharpened. The apprentice lifted the scissors and unfolded a length of strop, a narrow strip of vegetable-tanned leather, locked in a simple wooden clamp. He secured the scissors by the handle, braced them lightly, and brought the cutting edge to the strop at a shallow angle. In gentle, confident strokes, 5 on each side, he drew the blade along the lustrous leather. With each pass came a whisper, knife on leather, metal kissed by hide. He paused, tested the edge on a stray wick, and watched as the blade seared the fiber cleanly, leaving no fray or fuzz behind. A quiet satisfaction settled over him, mirrored in the master's approving nod across the room. As the hearth crackled, a third apprentice moved to the balance scales resting on a low shelf near a stack of wax blocks. The brass pans and iron beam gleamed softly under the candlelight, and a set of brass weights sat in a little velvet pouch, each stamped with its precise measure. The apprentice opened the pouch and selected a handful of weights, 2 ounces, 1 ounce, half an ounce, arranging them in descending order on a piece of parchment. He reached for a pale block of beeswax, its surface marked by faint ridges where it had cooled in its mold the day before. The block felt cool and slightly tacky under his fingertips, a delicate scent of honey and floriated fields rising from it. He set it in the left pan of the scale, then added brass weights to the right until the beam came to perfect balance. The total weight appeared in small scrawled numbers on the parchment, 12 ounces 1/2 doctor. Under his breath, he noted the figure and pressed his quill into an ink well to record it. The ink pooled thickly on the paper before beading and drying into a fine dark dot. Next, he scooped up a darker block of tallow, heavier and denser, with a faintly sour tang that spoke of its origin in rendered animal fat. He repeated the weighing, adding brass weights and jotting down the measure in the ledger. Beside the blocks lay small wooden boxes of additives, pinches of powdered stearin, bowls of crushed resin. A few shavings of each were measured, weighed, and set aside for the afternoon's blending experiments. Every fragment was accounted for, every trace of material noted in the day's supply log. The rhythmic tap of his quill on the oak tabletop blended with the soft hum of flame and the distant toll of the church bells marking the 11th hour. During these tasks, the candles on the bench continued their silent performance. One flickered as a draft traced the edge of a window, but the apprentice promptly leaned forward, adjusting the little draft curtain and straightening the candle in its iron holder. Another flame, taller than the rest by a finger's breadth, was noted as anomalous. The master observed it for a moment longer, then instructed an apprentice to extinguish that candle, trim its wick, and prepare it for a side trial in the afternoon's blend tests, its unusual behavior perhaps a clue to how wax mixtures or wick thickness might be refined. With the stores refreshed, the tools honed, and the raw materials weighed and logged, the workshop seemed to exhale, as though drawing a deep breath before the next sequence of work. The mid-morning supply check, so unhurried and precise, had gathered every element into readiness. The soft scent of wood smoke, the metallic tang of sharpened steel, the floral sweetness of beeswax, and the creamy heaviness of tallow formed a subtle tapestry of aromas that lingered in each apprentice's memory. At the master's signal, a hush fell. He swept his gaze across the room, surveying the prepared crucibles, the neat stacks of wax blocks, the sharpened scissors poised for trim. In a tone as calm as the gentle swell of daylight, he announced that the afternoon blend trials would begin shortly. The apprentices bowed their heads in acknowledgement, storing their quills and closing the supply ledger. The next chapter of toil, where beeswax, tallow, and stearin would meld in precise proportions, where new wicks would stand in drizzled wax to test their metal, awaited them. And so the mid-morning supply check concluded not with fanfare, but with a quiet symmetry, each step seamlessly leading into the next. The hearth's embers glowed steadily, the candles continued their slow dance, and the workshop, anchored in the rhythms of coal, blade, and scale, prepared itself for the long, soothing afternoon of candle-making that lay just beyond the calm threshold of this ritual. A gentle hush settled over the workshop as the sun reached its highest point, sending slanted rays of pale gold through the dirt-streaked windows. The heat of midday lay heavy upon the stones, warming every surface and lending a soft, steady glow to the hearth's embers. Apprentices moved through this drowsy light with practiced quietude, as if not to disturb the tranquil cadence of wax and wick that defined the day. At the center of the bench, a modest copper cauldron had been freshly emptied and scoured free of morning's beeswax residue. Today's experiment would blend three distinct fats, beeswax, tallow, and the newly arrived stearin crystals, into a single formulation that might combine hardness, clarity, and longevity in a single taper. The master began by measuring the beeswax and tallow in their traditional 70-30 ratio. Each apprentice bore a small brass scale, its pans gleaming faintly under the hearth lamp. Blocks of pale, honeyed beeswax were weighed first, their smooth surfaces resisting the weight of the iron weights until they read exactly 14 ounces. The tallow blocks, dense and clay-colored, followed in turn, measured to 6 ounces. These were then transferred with a slow, deliberate motion into the cauldron, the soft thud of wax on metal as comforting as a distant church bell. Under the apprentice's careful eye, coals were shifted to ensure even heating. The cauldron sat above the hearth, its warmth coaxing the mixture just to the edge of melting. Golden ribbons of beeswax began to slacken, then dissolved into a glossy pool. Tallow followed, thicker in consistency, clouding the sheen into an opalescent swirl. A silver ladle circled, lifting a bit of the mixture to cool in a spoon, the apprentice dipping a finger to test the texture. It was smooth but not yet homogeneous, a subtle marbling remained where the tallow clung like mist. The apprentice inclined the spoon to let a small bead slip back into the pool, a silent note that would guide the next stir. As the blend neared uniform fluidity, the master reached for a small wooden box of stearin crystals, white, opaque granules reminiscent of tiny eggshell fragments. They would add rigidity, a firming agent to prevent soft bending of the taper's lower body. With a careful, almost lyrical gesture, a teaspoon of crystals was drizzled into the molten fats. Each granule sank, then melted in a faint whisper, as if exhaling a sigh of warmth. The crucible's contents turned milky, shifting from honeyed amber to a pale opaline glow. Once the mixture glinted with perfect uniformity, the apprentices prepared the wooden plank for test strips. This plank, a long, narrow board seasoned by years of wax strips, bore grooves carved to guide each pour. Line after line had been added over countless afternoons, and now it served as a canvas for the day's trial. The apprentices dipped slender iron spouts into the cauldron, drawing up small ladles of the blend. Then, with measured hand, they guided streams of wax into the grooves, each pour a thin ribbon, an exact quarter-inch in width, running the length of the board. The gentle hiss of hot wax meeting cool wood rose and fell like distant surf. Between pores, the master paused to inspect the consistency. He tapped the plank with a slender wooden dowel. The soft click resonated differently across sections. In some, rigidity spoke of a firmer styron influence, in others, the wax still bore the supple warmth of tallow. He noted the differences in his leather-bound notebook, small sketches of each groove accompanied by annotations in spidery ink. Groove 3, slight yield under tap. Groove 4, crisp fracture. Each notation was a promise of refinement for tomorrow's candles. As the test strips cooled, the apprentices lined them along the bench, their edges perfectly parallel. Fascinated fingers traced the surfaces, noting how light refracted through each ribbon. In the thinner sections, the blend shimmered, faint veins of beeswax still suggesting the original hue. In the thicker applications, the tallow lent a softness, almost a milky translucence. The styron, least visible to the eye, had nonetheless rigidified the mass, as one could feel by pressing a fingernail along the edge. It left no impression, whereas the pure beeswax sections would have dented beneath such pressure. Tiny curls of scrap wax, trimmed free of rough edges, dropped into a small iron brazier, where they smoldered with a fragrance that mingled honey and hearth smoke. The apprentices paused to inhale, the compound aroma both familiar and reassuring. In each breath, they tasted the labors of dawn's first melts, mid-morning ignitions, and now this delicate alchemy of afternoon. With the test strips reserved for final review, the apprentices returned their focus to larger molds. Steel cylinders of half-inch diameter waited patiently for their share of the master blend. Each mold was clamped in place between wooden blocks to stabilize its position. The apprentices dipped dipping frames into the cauldron, raising the molten wax high above the rim before allowing a single drop to fall. This process repeated, dip, lift, pause, and withdraw, an exercise in fluid restraint. Slowly, a cast of slender tapers built up layer by layer, each new coat measured by the seconds of immersion. Time, rather than volume, dictated thickness, 5 seconds per dip for the first 10 layers, 7 for the next 5. While a taper grew, another apprentice labored over the ledger. Quill in hand, she sketched the rate of adhesion, her ink flowing in dark lines that curved between columns of weight and temperature. Layer 1, 5s, adherent, no drips. Layer 11, 7s, surface fine, slight bloom on cool. These annotations would ensure that when the final candles emerged at dusk, they would be identical twins of consistency. All the while, the workshop remained quiet in its purpose. A faint crackle rose from the brazier where the scrap wax smoldered. The only other sounds were the soft footfalls on straw, the distant tolling of a nearby mill bell, and the rich hum of wax breathing against iron. The apprentices moved in time with this rhythm, neither hurried nor slow, each step guided by long-remembered ritual. As the low sun began to tilt westward, the master gathered the test strips for one last inspection. He lifted them to the light, turning each at a slight angle to observe internal textures. With a thin bone folder, he scored one strip across its width. The rigid break spoke of a robust mix, yet the jagged fracture hinted that future trials might reduce the styron by a fraction. Next, he prodded another strip with the quill's tip, noting how the soft tallow still lent a little give. With a slow nod, he set aside his conclusions for tomorrow's adjustment. Finally, the apprentices replaced the wooden plank in its place, brushing away any stray particles of wax with a soft bristled brush. The cauldron of afternoon blend was allowed to cool, its final contents spooned into a small iron pot for the evening's aromatic experiments. Wick scissors were sharpened, and the day's spoils, wax shavings, spent crystals, used ladle, were tidied with respectful care. In the warm afterglow of the hearth, the master paused by the door, lifting a hand to hush the lingering clatter. He looked across the benches and saw the apprentices' faces drawn in placid concentration, each quietly satisfied by the afternoon's toil. Tomorrow would bring new trials, perhaps a return to pure beeswax, or the addition of tinted oils, but today's blend had come closest to the elusive balance of hardness, burn time, and clarity. Outside, the sky hinted at dusk, Inside, the workshop prepared for the next chapter in its unbroken ritual. The glow of ember and lamp would soon be joined by the final call of candlelight, but for now, the quiet breath of wax and wick settled, slow and deliberate, like the closing notes of a long, harmonious hymn. And so the afternoon blend trials concluded, another careful step along the path to the perfect taper. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the high workshop windows, casting narrow slivers of glow across the long oak bench. The air was warm with the lingering heat of the hearth, and the soft hiss of molten wax waiting in its copper pot formed a steady undertone. After hours spent blending beeswax, tallow, and stearin in the previous trials, today's focus turned to a subtler variable, the fibers that would carry flame. Thick or thin, linen or rush, each wick promised a different balance between steady glow and smoke. 1. Gathering the wicks. Along one wall, coiled bundles of twisted linen lay beside pale sheaves of rush. The master, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, beckoned 2 apprentices forward. "Observe," he murmured, voice low against the workshop hush. With gloved hands, he lifted a linen strand, rough against his fingertips, yet with a firm, consistent twist. He then offered a rush wick, its slender cross-section and looser braid visible under the amber light. Apprentices inhaled softly, noting the diverging scents, linen's neutral, cottony promise against rush's earthier tang. Bench hooks held small wooden dowels, each clipped at one end with a simple brass clasp. The apprentices selected 4 lengths of linen, each cut to a uniform 8 inches, and 8 of the thinner rush wicks, twice as many to compensate for their finer gauge. The master measured them by eye, verifying diameter against a parchment scale hung nearby. Minute variations could mean a sootier burn or a lean, flickering flame. 2. Securing wicks in clips. With precision born of daily practice, the apprentices slid each wick's end into provisional clips, their tiny jaws snapping closed with a faint click. The clips themselves were anchored to a low bar, suspended above a shallow pan of warm wax. The aim was twofold, to straighten each wick before immersion, and to ensure an even layer of coating when the wax was later poured. The master adjusted a wick's tension, allowing it to hang just an inch above the pan's surface. He reminded the apprentices of an old notation from a late 17th century folio, "Let the strand dangle but breath the heat, not touch it. So shall the wax imprint evenly." One by one, the wicks dipped and hovered, their fibers softening and taking on the wax's ivory sheen. Occasionally, a stray air bubble formed along a twisted fiber, the apprentice gently nudged it free, letting the bubble rise and burst. 3. Heating the test candles. While the wick set, another apprentice fetched slender molds, tapers cast the previous morning, now room temperature and solid. A small fire burned in a corner brazier, tending a low, even heat. A copper ladle scooped warmed blend from the pot, its surface gently rippling. Each taper mold received a careful pour, first a trickle around the wick's base, then a gradual fill as the apprentice circled the mold. He paused to tap away trapped air that might climb the wick during burning. After each fill, the molds rested on a sand-filled tray to cool. The light glimmered off the fresh wax skins. In a hush, the workshop seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the moment flameless wax would greet flame. 4. First illuminations and timings. Once the wax hardened sufficiently, tested by a fingertip pressed against its side, the apprentices removed the clips. Each wick stood vertical, anchored by a neat collar of wax at the center of its mold. The master retrieved his brass snips, trimming each wick to precisely 6 mm above the wax. He explained gently, "Too long, and the flame smolders hot, too short, and it starves. We seek that fine equilibrium." Oil lamps were dimmed, leaving the test area lit only by the hearth's glow. One by one, the master lit the first sample's wick. A brief flare, a soft sigh as the wax warmed, and then a steady column of amber. An apprentice started his hourglass timer and readied his quill. On a new page of the day's ledger, he wrote, "Sample A1, linen wick, twist count 14 per inch, initial flame height 2.5 inches, smoke absent for first 2 minutes." Each subsequent sample followed, heavier linen strands in pairs, then single rush wicks. The thinner fibers yielded a shorter, fatter flame that flickered more, a light sooty trail curling upward after mere moments. The apprentices marked every nuance, how the thin rush flared quickly, how the linen took longer to warm but then burned evenly, how the flame lean into the drafts flicked amber tongues against the stone wall. 5. Whispered observations. The room filled with the soft scratch of quill on parchment, the fine click of hourglass turning, and the distant clock's measured chime. Together, master and apprentices recorded first signs of smoke. A1 saw none before 5 minutes, B2, the thickest linen, showed grey wisps at 7, R3, a rush fibre slender as a hair, wafted dark curls at barely 3. Beyond mere height and soot, they noted flame steadiness, did it lean, jitter, or sag with wax pool. In the margins, the master scribed shorthand notations, asterisks beside promising samples, a small wavy line for those that sputtered. A faint honeyed scent of blended wax intermingled with the earthy tang of rush, and somewhere behind it all, the subtle musk of leather-bound ledgers. 6. Reflection before dusk. When the final sample's timer rang, the master gently blew out the wick, listening to the soft hiss as molten wax sealed itself. He surveyed the bench, 8 candlesticks burning in curious tandem, each flame its own quiet study. Apprentices withdrew the hourglasses, turned them once more, and began comparing exact burn durations. The workshop, bathed in flickering lamplight, carried a gentle hush deeper than any morning's first tasks. The master nodded at the gathered records. Tomorrow, we introduce scent. Yet today, these trials remind us, flame depends as much on the wick's spine as on wax's heart. A perfect wick stands in silent service, drawing up molten wax in equal measure, feeding the fire cleanly, without harsh smoke. Such is our quiet craft. He closed the ledger's flap, tucking away quills and sealing inkwells to await the next dawn. Outside, the sky began to bruise with violet twilight. In the chamber's calm, only the final test candles remained alight, their soft glow marking a ritual nearly forgotten by busy households beyond these walls, a ritual that, in its gentle precision, sustained every candlelit hour of an 18th-century night. The amber glow of the hearth had softened to a gentle warmth by mid-afternoon, and in the low-ceilinged workshop the apprentices moved with a deliberate slowness as they prepared for the aromatic trials that would mark the 11th chapter of the day's experiment. From the narrow shuttered windows, pale shafts of light sifted through drifting motes of candle smoke, lending the air a tranquil haze. Each deep breath carried the faint whisper of beeswax and the lingering tang of Styrian crystals, and in this half-dusk setting the next phase in the ritual, introducing subtle fragrances to the wax, felt almost sacred. On a small oak table, polished smooth by decades of use, lay the gathered ingredients for the floral infusion, a handful of delicate, lavender blossoms, their tiny petals a dusky purple, and a scattering of rose petals, thin as tissue and blushing with soft pink. The master carefully passed the lavender to an apprentice whose steady fingers separated stalk from blossom, and each petal was laid in a shallow pewter dish. The scent of dried lavender, cool, herbaceous, slightly camphorous, rose softly, mingling with the ambient warmth. Beside it, the rose petals, still faintly fragrant from the bloom, lent their own sweet, almost honeyed perfume. With a slender brass mortar and pestle, the apprentice began the slow, meditative work of mincing. Each rhythmic turn of the pestle against the dish produced a faint crush, barely audible above the distant drip of molten wax from a nearby ladle. The petals ground into fine fragments, releasing oils that perfumed the air like a gentle breeze through a late summer garden. The master watched with a serene expression, his own hand poised to measure out precise weights of the crushed flowers once the texture was deemed correct. Meanwhile, another apprentice prepared the pine pitch resin. In a small, fire-blackened crucible set atop a tripod over a modest charcoal brazier, chipped fragments of deep amber resin began to soften and liquefy. The resin glowed with a honeyed translucence as it melted, its aroma a warm, resinous note redolent of forest dusk, pine needles, and sun-warmed bark. A slender bronze spoon emerged to stir the molten resin in measured circles, each swirl capturing air in tiny bubbles that popped with delicate sparklings. When the resin had become a smooth, viscous liquid, it was carefully transferred in measured drops to a second, larger copper pot of gently heated, already melted beeswax. The addition of pine pitch altered the wax's clarity, lending it a pale, golden haze as it was stirred in. The master dipped a clean quill into a small inkwell of neutral oil and marked each batch's proportions, 3 drops of resin to every ounce of beeswax, on the day's ledger. Each notation was written in the margin beside previous entries of wick thickness and blend ratios. As the floral infusion was weighed, 2 drams of minced lavender to 1 dram of rose, the apprentices gently folded the dried petals into yet more melted beeswax. The wax, heated only just above its melting point, embraced the fragments of petals like a soft current, suspending them in delicate swirls. The apprentice ladled the scented wax into slender tallow molds while the crushed petals drifted languidly, promising subtle color and gentle aroma once solidified. Throughout the process, the workshop was hushed, the only sounds those of soft footfalls on straw-strewn boards, the whisper of quills scratching on parchment, and the occasional hiss as a hot tool met a drop of wax. The master's voice, when he spoke, was low and even. Observe the clarity and the weight of scent in each shard. Allow them to cool until firm, then break a piece and inhale deeply. Record the balance between floral sweetness and resinous warmth. Minutes passed as the newly cast samples gradually cooled. Apprentices gathered in a half-circle by a small wooden bench, lit by a single candle of yesterday's blend. Each took a shard from the floral-infused batch, held it momentarily in the glow, and then raised it to their nose. The lavender had softened in the wax's embrace, its edges rounding into a gentle herbal bouquet. The rose petals retained a faint blush of their bloom, weaving a whisper of sweet warmth through the cooler tones. By contrast, the pine pitch shards exuded a deeper, earthier fragrance, like a forest after rain. The warmth of the beeswax carried the resin's pungency more softly, rounding it to a subdued, smoky wood note. One apprentice, eyes closed, inhaled the scent and noted a trace of resin beneath the floral top note, as though a woodland glade lay just beyond the lavender field. The master inclined his head in approval, and the apprentice dipped his quill to note this subtle observation. After each inhalation, the apprentices crumbled the shard between thumb and forefinger, listening for the clean snap that signaled proper wax hardness. Too brittle, and the candle would flake; too pliant, and it risked softening in warmer rooms. With each crack, they adjusted ratios: more lavender for clarity of bouquet, more rose for sweetness, additional resin for depth. These tiny calibrations were recorded meticulously, each line of the ledger a map toward the perfect aromatic balance. Occasionally, the master held aloft a shard of the current favorite blend and inhaled. The pause was long, and in that stillness the workshop felt suspended, as if all labor had still to honor that single breath. Even distant church bells marking the afternoon hour ceased to intrude on the quiet intensity. When he laid the shard down, his nod was faint but decisive, and the apprentices moved to replicate the proportions in a final test pour. By the time the last molds were filled, the workshop had begun its slow pivot toward evening. Shadows stretched across the rough-hewn benches, and the faint coolness of approaching dusk cooled the air. Yet within the workshop walls, the new aromatic candles sat poised to offer warmth and fragrance, tiny beacons of lavender rose pine promise. The master surveyed the day's accumulated ledgers, noting the assured progression from first trial to final blend. As he closed the last page of the aromatic trials, he spoke softly to the assembled apprentices: "Tomorrow, we shall consult the manuals, those folios of 17th-century wisdom, to see which of these sensorial experiments align with the guidance of our predecessors. We shall match our notes to their recipes and refine our craft further." A gentle murmur of anticipation rippled through the group, for the promise of hidden recipes and age-worn advice awaited in leather-bound tomes. In that moment, the candles and their molds seemed to glow with possibility. The filtered daylight, browned by the workshop's smoky panes, revealed a translucent sheen in each sample, tiny constellations of petals and fragments of resin caught in quenched wax. Outside, a soft breeze stirred, riffling the shutters like a whisper. Inside, the ritual of scent had woven another thread into the day's slow tapestry, preparing the craftspeople for the historic texts that would guide tomorrow's refinements. And so, in calm anticipation, the workshop settled into its customary hush, poised between the fragrant interlude just concluded and the age-old wisdom about to be rediscovered. The late afternoon light in the workshop had taken on a mellow, golden hue when the master quietly crossed the room and lifted from a high shelf a heavy, leather-bound folio. Its cover was rough with age, cracked at the spine and held by two small brass clasps that sighed as they released. A hush fell over the apprentices, who paused in their trimming and ledger-writing, turning toward the worn volume as though it were an altar. The master laid it gently on the oak table, the surface scarred by years of dripping wax and fine scratches from quills. Warm air from the hearth drifted upward, carrying the scent of beeswax and old parchment, and mingled with the faint tang of iron from the brass clasps. With deliberate care, he opened the folio to its first bookmarked section, where the margins were crowded with elegant cursive notes in sepia ink. These annotations dated back to the last years of the 17th century, scribbles by a long-forgotten candle maker who had studied the arts of illumination more as a subtle science than a humble trade. The pages rustled softly under calloused fingertips as the apprentices leaned in, drawn by the ritual of rediscovering bygone knowledge. Their task was twofold: to translate the archaic measurements, scruples, drams, and grains, into the workshop's own standard of ounces and drams, and to harvest any insight on flame consistency, wick composition, or wax blending that might refine the day's trials. The master raised a quill and dipped it into an ink well, its surface gleaming like a still pond beneath candlelight. He began to copy heading titles. De proportionibus albi ceri ad sebum bovis. On the proportions of white wax to ox tallow. Each letter brushed the paper with a quiet authority. Passing the folio to a senior apprentice, the master motioned toward a recipe for a 3-part beeswax and 1-part tallow blend, tempered with powdered resin from Turk's pine. The original entry called for 1/2 ounce of resin to every 5-dram measure of the wax, a formula that promised a steadier flame and reduced smoke. Yet the old weights had been based on a scale slightly lighter than their own. The apprentice consulted a small brass balance, placing a single tallow pellet on one pan and counterweights on the other, until it hovered exactly at 2 drams. Then he noted in a fresh margin. Modern equivalent, 1:4 beeswax to tallow, pine resin at 2% by weight, yields bright amber flame. As quills scratched across paper, the room filled with an almost reverent murmur. Pages turned, revealing insights on wick taper, high-twist linen wicks, the writer insisted, drew fuel upward more steadily but burned faster, whereas coarser rush wicks produced a lower, steadier glow at the expense of occasional soot. The margin notes recommended a compromise: wool-cord linen, plied with not fewer than 20 twists per inch. An apprentice measured a short segment of wick against the biometric gauge pinned to the wall, counting twists beneath a brass magnifier that glowed softly in the light. For each passage marked, the master paused to reflect aloud. This scribe warns against wax too cold when poured, lest the wick be imprisoned and starve the flame. We have seen such stutters this morning. He gestured to the half-formed tapers on the bench, their surfaces faintly pocked where wax had cooled unevenly. With renewed purpose, the apprentices gathered powders of powdered stearin and jars of clarified tallow, ready to test a second blend under the guidance of the folio's wisdom. Between translations, the workshop's air grew still, punctuated only by the soft scratching of feather quills and the gentle sigh of turning pages. Here and there, the rustle of parchment sounded like the wings of resting birds, and the low glow of a single test candle highlighted the faded script on each leaf. Flecks of dust drifting in the lamplight seemed to hover in mid-air, as though time itself had gathered to witness this act of remembering. In one passage, the 17th-century artisan had spilled a snippet of personal reflection: when the hearth's laughter fades, and only the candle remains, true comfort lies in her steadfast presence. The master lingered over those words, tracing them with a fingertip darkened by ink. A hush fell again, and an apprentice gently closed the folio, sliding it across the table toward a small pile of fresh parchment. Now came the quiet work of adaptation. Small flasks of resin solution were measured out in graduated glass vials, the master's steady hand tilting each vial until a droplet formed at its tip. Those droplets fell into a copper beaker of melted wax, leaving tiny ripples that cooled at once in the cool draft rising under a nearby window. A student whisked the beaker over the hearth, stirring with a silver ladle until the wax gleamed like stirred honey. The scent of pine resin deepened, warming the workshop with a resinous sweetness. With the formulas freshly inscribed in the day's ledger, the apprentices prepared new wicks, linen cords briefly singed over a candle's flame to seal stray threads, and counted precise lengths with a steel rule. Their movements were methodical, almost choreographed, as if the ghost of the original scribe looked over their shoulders, guiding each cut, each pour. Finally, when the master pronounced the recipes adequately transcribed, he closed the folio with a soft thud that resonated through the silent workshop. He laid a weighty stone atop its cover to hold the pages flat for the next day's work. At that moment, the apprentices realized that they had bridged centuries. The rituals of candle growth, refinement, and testing remained much as they had always been, an interplay of heat, wax, and wick, shaped by patient minds committed to the same goal of constant illumination. As the 3 new experimental tapers cooled at the hearth's edge, the master rose and announced the next step. Tonight, we calibrate these with careful precision. By tomorrow's dusk, we shall know whether our forebears' methods fulfill their promise in our own hands. With that, the workshop settled into a quieter rhythm, preparing for Chapter 13's late afternoon calibration, where every ounce and twist would be fine-tuned to perfection. The old manuals had spoken, it was now the living workshop's turn to answer. A pale golden light filtered through the high workshop windows, carrying with it the hush that descends only in the final hours before dusk. The long shadows of benches and barrels stretched across the straw-scattered floor, and the hearth, its red embers now reduced to glowing coals, seemed to pulse in quiet resonance with the tapering daylight. In this gentle liminality, when the morning's bustle had settled into a steady rhythm and the evening hush had not yet arrived, the master and his apprentices prepared for the last critical stage of the day's candle trials, the late afternoon calibration. A small knot of youthful figures gathered at the central workbench, their movements measured and deliberate. On the bench lay a row of shallow wooden bowls, each carefully labeled with the morning's batch numbers. Beside them, a polished brass scale, its pans gleaming in the soft light, waited to receive the wax that had cooled into solid forms. The air carried the mingled scents of beeswax's honeyed warmth, the deeper musk of tallow, and the slight tang of powdered additives still clinging to lingering fragments in the spoil basket. A single apprentice bent to lift the first bowl, holding it aloft so that the master might verify its identity against the ledger's inscriptions. Master Alphonse's voice was low and unhurried. "Batch 37, my dear Jonas," he murmured, peering over the apprentice's shoulder. His long-fingered hand brushed a stray fleck of wax from the bowl's rim before he nodded. "Proceed." With the solemnity of a small ritual, Jonas set the bowl upon the scale's left pan. He added a slender counterweight to the opposite side, adjusting until the beam balanced with near imperceptible tremors. Then, with a practiced eye, he eased another 10th-ounce weight onto the right pan, until the scale read exactly the measure the master had determined from the old folio's instructions. The bowl was lifted once more, and the measured wax was tipped back into a shallow trough, its surface ripple-andentaled by the transfer. One by one, each batch passed this scrutiny. The apprentices rotated tasks, labeling bowls, resetting the scale, reconciling any slight variances with careful notes in the margin of the day's ledger. A hush prevailed, no sudden sounds, only the soft clink of metal against wood, the muted scrape of wax against a bowl's edge, the almost inaudible exhalation of long concentration. It was as if the workshop itself held its breath, honoring this pivotal moment when all prior tests finally converged into a precise plan for the last molds of the day. When the final bowl had been weighed, and corrected within a hair's breadth of accuracy, Master Alphonse signaled a pause. He retrieved the leather-bound manual from a nearby shelf, its pages filled with recipes and margin notes penned by candle makers long since gone. Opening to a well-thumbed section, he read aloud, his voice steady, "For a balanced blend tending toward a smooth, even burn, ensure the beeswax weight does not exceed 39 carats per ounce of tallow." The apprentices leaned closer. The master's gentle emphasis on each archaic measurement lent gravity to every word. From the manual's guidance, they turned next to their wicks. On a separate bench lay bundles of linen and twisted rush, each bound by coarse twine and tagged with diameter and twist count. Early trials that morning had shown that overly tight twists produced unwanted soot, while looser preparations yielded flickering instability. Master Alphonse drew forward a coil of linen wick that bore a small red ribbon, its strands plied 7 twists to the inch. Let us reduce the twist count by 1, he decided, that the flame's oxygen might feed evenly without singeing the walls of our candles. Apprentices took up tiny shears, their blades sharp and gleaming, and snipped individual wick sections to the exact length prescribed by the folio, 6.5 millimeters above the wax. Then they gently unwound a braid's fine strands, letting them relax until the twist count measured 6 turns per inch. Each wick was carefully resecured to its paper tag, and all were laid out in neat procession. As daylight waned, the workshop's single oil lamp, hung from a hook overhead, cast a pool of mellow illumination around the wick station. In that small circle of light, the fibrous threads glowed ivory white, as though inviting the evening flame yet to come. At last, the moment arrived to pour the final set of semi-cylindrical molds. These molds, made of polished tin lined with a thin layer of beeswax to ease release, rested cooling on a sand bed at the bench's far edge. Apprentices carried copper scoops filled with freshly remelted wax, warmed ever so slightly above the midday blend temperature. In the soft lamp glow, molten wax gleamed like molten sunlight. The air filled with its warm aroma, a rounded sweetness imbued with the faintest hint of resin from the pine pitch added at mid-morning. Master Alphonse stood before the molds, his posture unhurried, his eyes keen. Pour slowly, he instructed. A steady stream, as if trailing out the final notes of a soft melody. Jonas took the first scoop, dipped the lip of the copper bowl just above the mold's rim, and let the wax flow in a controlled spiraling motion. The wax swirled in the mold, spiraling inward until the cavity brimmed. He withdrew the scoop, and a little extra dripped at his fingertips, warm against his skin. A secondary drop fell, then another, until the mold's edge bore a gentle collar of wax. Every apprentice followed suit, the pouring synchronized, each motion echoing the next like breathing. The dripping slowed as the final molten beads broke free. At that point, Master Alphonse whispered, "Patience now. Let them settle." No one spoke. The mold sat silently as the wax contracted, tracing the subtle shrinkage lines that would later guide precise trimming of the candle shafts. In that lingering silence, one could hear the world beyond the workshop's thick door, a distant church bell tolling the hour, a cartwheel creaking along cobblestones, the faint murmur of a guard on his beat. But within the walls, time seemed to slow even further, stretched taut by the anticipation of results yet unseen. The apprentices brushed stray wax nuggets into the spoil basket, their hands careful not to disturb the sand bed or nudge a mold out of alignment. A cool draft drifted in through a crack in the window, an evening breeze carrying autumn's first chill, and the succeeding hush felt like an invitation to reflection on the labor that linked them to centuries of makers before. Finally, Master Alphonse lifted a hand. "We rest here," he declared softly, "until tomorrow's dawn reveals what we have wrought." And so, in that calm pause, as the last rays of sun dipped low, the workshop settled into quiet repose. The scales and bowls lay idle, the adjusted wicks awaited their moment in softer semi-cylinders of wax. The world outside darkened, but within, a persistent warmth remained, a quiet glow held in abeyance until the final trials under lamp and flame. Thus concluded the late afternoon calibration, a tapestry of precise measures, careful twist adjustments, and the hushed pouring of wax that would soon yield candles of measured steadiness and grace. It was a ritual at once simple and profound, an homage to craftsmanship's slow turning wheel, and a promise of lamplight yet to guide weary hands and restless thoughts. The late sun, softened by drifting clouds, lent the workshop a gentle, even glow as the apprentices moved with hushed purpose. On a long, oaken bench, its surface smoothed by years of wax spills and gentle brushing, stood the day's final creations, slender tapers and stubby test candles, each bearing the faint fingerprint of its maker's hand. The wood grain beneath them shone dully, as though offering its grain to bear witness. The air was warm but not oppressive, carrying a hint of honeyed beeswax and the smokeless tang of refined tallow. Outside, a church bell tolled the passing hour, yet within the stone walls there was only quiet, measured movement. One by one, the apprentices placed the cooled candles under a simple wooden frame that held a row of small, clear glass shades. Each shade admitted the same steady beam of light from a single candle lamp positioned just above. The uniform illumination spilled across the candle's surfaces, revealing minute variations in color and texture, a faint striation where the wax had settled more heavily, a barely perceptible ridge tracing the spiral of the mold seam. Even the slightest curve, an almost invisible tapering of shaft, could be discerned when the soft light struck it at the right angle. The master, standing behind the bench, adjusted the lamp's height by a notch, his hand steady despite the flicker of his own candle. He wore the same linen smock he had donned at dawn, its sleeves rolled back to reveal forearms dusted with pale wax powder. A small leather-bound ledger lay open before him, its pages filled with neat, cramped script. Across 2 columns, entries recorded precise burn times, measured in minutes and seconds, alongside observations of flame height, steadiness, and the faintest wisp of smoke. An apprentice approached with a slender taper in hand. He held it under the glass shade, pivoting it slowly to catch the full spectrum of the lamp's glow. The master dipped his quill into a pot of deep red ink, secured under watchful lid so that no careless drop could mar the ledger's pages, and traced a notation beside the candle's entry, Candle 14, 3 hours 12 minutes, steady 2-inch flame, no soot. The red ink, glossy at first, settled into the paper with a quiet bloom, marking this candle as one that met the high standard the workshop upheld. Behind them, 2 younger apprentices exchanged a glance as they lined up the next batch. Each candle lay equidistant, their wicks unlit, awaiting inspection. The workshop's hearth had been banked to a gentle warmth some minutes ago, and its coals no longer glowed fiery orange but a steady, muted red, just enough to smooth stray drips of wax at the bench's edge. The soft crackle of wood in the brazier, mingled with the faint scrape of quill on paper, formed a rhythm both comforting and solemn. The master ran a slender ivory rule along the shafts of several candles, measuring their circumference to ensure uniform thickness. In the dim light, the rule cast a narrow, dancing shadow. When one sample registered a hair's breadth outside the ideal gauge, he lifted it and gave it a gentle snap. The sound was crisp, a single, satisfying crack that echoed briefly before dying away. The candle split cleanly, revealing an inner core of wax that, to the seasoned eye, bore a slightly mottled hue. With a subtle nod, he set the piece aside for remelting in the evening's final batch. Attention returned to the ledger. The master read aloud, softly, so that all present could follow, Sample 12, burn uneven, flame tilts westward after 1 hour. Sample 15, slight wobble at base, but consistent burn for 3 hours. Sample 16, ideal. At each proclamation, an apprentice would step forward, retrieve the corresponding candle from the bench, and hold it as the master dipped a fine quill into the red ink. A small seal, applied as gently as a brushstroke, signified official approval. The bright red dot stood out boldly against the pale wax, a marker of excellence in an unspoken hierarchy of quality. In the hush that followed, one apprentice turned to the rest, raising a hand to draw their gaze upward. Above the bench, pinned to the wall, were the faded pages of an older ledger, records from the previous season, barely legible in places but still revered. A margin note in the 18th century master's own hand advised, "Seek the candle that burns straight through the night's darkest hour without falter. Let it be known by its unwavering glow." The current master touched the margin, as if absorbing a whisper from the past, then exhaled a breath that fogged the glass shade momentarily before clearing. The candle lamp's steady light glimmered on the red seals, each one promising a lifetime of reliability in parlors, studies, and quiet late-night conversations. The apprentices watched, rapt and silent, as the master closed the ledger. The final tally glowed on the page, a dozen candles marked perfect, several more acceptable, and a small handful destined for remelting. The air felt charged with anticipation, as though the simple act of comparison had revealed not only the day's triumphs but the promise of better candles still to come. Outside, dusk deepened into evening. The uniform sunlight that had guided the tallying now gave way to soft shadows creeping across the workshop floor. The apprentices relit a single trial candle at the bench's center, watching its flame steady itself against the encroaching dusk. Its light seemed to draw the gathering day's work into a single moment, a bridge between the precise measurements of daylight and the subtle demands of an oil lamp-lit night. The master offered a final instruction: gather these premium samples and set them aside. Tomorrow, we shall begin the long tapers. His voice was gentle, yet carried the weight of careful expectation. The apprentices rose, moving together in a practiced choreography as they lifted the marked candles, placing them in a shallow crate lined with soft cotton cloth. Each candlestick was wrapped, labeled with the date and the seal of approval, before being carried to the alcove reserved for finished goods. There, under lock and key, they would rest until they found their way into the homes that prized them for modest brilliance and unwavering steadiness. Silence settled once again, broken only by the slow hiss of cooling wax in the corner brazier and the distant call of a night bird beyond the workshop windows. In that stillness, the day's comparisons hung in the air like the afterimage of a flame. Every candle told its own story, of wax fluidity, of wick tension, of meticulous measurement, and together they formed the quiet ritual that defined this place. As the apprentices stepped away, the master lingered for a moment longer, tracing a finger along the bench where the final candle had rested, then extinguished the lamp above. Darkness, soft and complete, closed around the workshop, sealing the truths of the day until first light returned. By the time the workshop's mid-afternoon hush began to deepen into that soft, golden stillness, the master's chosen blend, the single, superior formulation drawn from nearly 100 trial candles, lay ready in a large copper vat. The vat itself, polished nearly to a mirror sheen by decades of careful maintenance, sat centered on a low, brick-lined hearth. Its wide, gently curved sides reflected the flicker of coals that still glowed faintly beneath, feeding a languid heat that coaxed the wax toward its liquid grace. Apprentice feet shuffled across the straw-strewn floor in muted choreography, gathering at the vat's rim to watch the slow transformation from solid block to honey-like melt. A quiet exhalation swept through the room as the first fragments of raw wax, a precise amalgam of beeswax, tallow, and just a whisper of stearin, slipped beneath the surface. They melted soundlessly, the coppa's warmth ever so gradually softening each sliver until it became an opalescent current. The master dipped a long-handled ladle, scooping up a glossy pool of molten wax, and let it drip back in slender threads. Each thread curved and fell, forming ripples on the vat's surface. Every motion was deliberate, measured, as if the very air between spoon and wax had weight and substance. Behind him, on a row of low benches, lay the slender wooden molds that would shape this day's perfect tapers. Each mold had been bored from seasoned beechwood, its interior sprinkled lightly with fine river sand to ensure that no wax adhered where it ought not. The apprentice charged with mold preparation tapped each cylinder gently against the bench, shaking away excess grains until only a whisper of sand coated the inside. A faint, dusty scent rose, earthy, a soft counterpoint to the sweeter fragrance of melting beeswax at the hearth. When the vat's contents shimmered with uniform fluidity, the master summoned his apprentices to form a silent line. The first apprentice lifted a single mold and, with a steady hand, tipped the copper ladle until a thin ribbon of wax issued forth. It poured in a slow, spiraling coil along the mold's length, lapping at the bottom before returning in smooth waves toward the rim. The workshop held its breath, for in that moment the rhythm of pouring must match the wax's pace. Too swift, and the wax would swell unevenly; too slow, and it would begin to set before it filled the mold. The master's eye was unerring, seeing the unspoken ideal in each coil, approving a slight tilting of the mold to guide the flow. As each mold was filled, the apprentice rotated it precisely, 1/8 turn every few heartbeats, so that the wax cooled evenly against the sand-dusted wood. Fingers, protected by well-worn leather mitts, grasped the molds near their bases, imparting just enough torque to keep the nascent candle in symmetrical form. A soft, Whispery scrapes sounded as the wax hardened imperceptibly against the mold's side. Tiny puffs of steam drifted from the copper at times, but the apprentices moved as one, so quietly that the only sounds were the subtle drip of wax, the occasional creak of wooden boards, and the master's low count, 1, 2, 3, turn. While the mold rotation continued, the room seemed to shrink around the vat's amber glow. The west-facing window admitted a slanted shaft of late afternoon light, dancing across the polished copper and catching motes of dust in midair, each particle a tiny, drifting star. The apprentices paused in that drifting stillness, hands poised on wooden cylinders, listening to the wax's faint murmurs as it settled into the mold's final embrace. In this moment, every apprentice felt the old rhythms that guided candle-making: heat and cool, pour and set, rotate and repeat. After a dozen or more molds had been filled and gently turned, the master set aside the ladle and motioned to the apprentice over the brazier in the room's corner. A small iron pail held broken pieces of imperfect wax, shavings and scraps deemed unsuitable for fine tapers. The apprentice carried it to the brazier's embers, and soon the pungent sweetness of recycled wax floated through the air, mingling with the richer scent of the master blend. This secondary melt served as a quiet reminder of the craft's cycle: nothing wasted, every fragment a step toward refinement. Once the final molds were in place, the apprentices eased back into shadowed corners to await cooling. The workshop's light narrowed to a mellow pool around the hearth. The wooden molds, now standing upright in sand-filled trays, wore coats of milky sheen where wax had begun to set. After several measured minutes, long enough for wax to firm yet still yield to gentle extraction, the master approached with a wooden mallet. With a firm but not forceful tap against each mold's rim, he loosened the wax cylinders. Out slipped dozens of gleaming tapers, each a slender shaft of uniform width, tapering gradually to a soft point at its tip. The apprentices gathered these newborn tapers, laying them on a long table and brushing away the last grains of sand. The candles gleamed in a spectrum of pale honey to warm ivory, their surfaces smooth as polished bone. Fingers ran along their shafts, feeling for imperfections, tiny ripples or air bubbles, and discarding any that failed to meet the master's exacting gaze. As the last candle found its place on the table, the master exhaled, a barely audible sound of satisfaction. He dusted his hands on a linen rag, then lifted a single taper as though presenting it to the room itself. Around him, the apprentices leaned forward, drawn into the hush of accomplishment. In that quiet chamber, held between the hearth's glow and the waning daylight, they witnessed the culmination of weeks of trials, the distilled essence of their craft concentrated in each taper's slender form. Now the perfect tapers rested in neat rows, ready to be trimmed, tested once more under the soft glow of evening lamps. But for this moment, with the final pour complete and the molds laid aside, the workshop breathed as one. The scent of beeswax and tallow, the gentle resonance of cooled copper, the smooth sweetness of wood and sand, all combined in a still harmony. Each apprentice felt the pulse of centuries of candlemakers in their midst, a legacy of quiet diligence and slow patience. And so, as cobwebs of twilight crept along the walls and the first stars began their distant vigil, chapter 15 reached its gentle close. The perfect tapers lay waiting. Below the hearth's final embers, the master whispered last instructions to prepare for the evening's trials by lamplight. In the hush of the workshop, the craft's quiet ritual carried on, unceasing, timeless, and softly glowing into the night ahead. The late afternoon sun had long surrendered behind slate rooftops when silence settled once more over the candle workshop. The great hearth, which for hours had roared with sustaining life, now displayed only glowing embers nestled among iron grate bars. Apprentices moved slowly, not out of weariness but in deference to the hush. Each step across the straw-strewn floor sounded muffled, measured, as though time itself had learned to tiptoe. In the fading day, they prepared for the final rite, evening trials by lamplight. Master Corby stood near the central bench, his silhouette framed by the dying amber of the hearth. He raised a hand, and two apprentices approached the wooden shelves where earthenware dishes held precious stocks of whale oil, flaxseed oil, and a small reserve of spiced nut oil tinted with rosemary resin. One by one, they decanted the pale liquids into slim-necked glass bottles, careful to avoid any tremor that might disturb the settled sediment. The soft clink of ceramic on wood rang out, then receded, leaving only the gentle susurrus of breathing and the distant creak of the building's timbers. A single apprentice climbed a small ladder to reach the highest shelf, where shaded lamps in matte black metal brackets awaited lighting. Each lamp had been filled earlier with oil drawn in the morning and left to clarity through a fine cloth filter. Now, they lifted them down and arranged them on a long, narrow table beneath the workshop's largest window. The panes were streaked with the day's condensation, and through them, the last rosy glow of dusk cupped the pale sky. Outside, a church bell tolled twice, its tone low and deliberate, then fell away into silence. One by one, apprentices trimmed the wicks of the lamps to exactly 4 millimeters, rotating scissors in practiced arcs to achieve a clean, even cut. The snip was soft, barely audible, yet to those who labored here it resonated like a signal that the true test was about to begin. A folded scrap of linen caught the tiny wicking fragments. Each flake would be weighed at day's end, to account for material loss and maintain absolute consistency in wick length. Master Corby lit the first lamp with a taper borrowed from the morning's trials. The flame leapt forward, burning clear and steady, then settled into an even, amber pool of light. For a moment, the workshop was bathed in that warm glow, soft enough to soothe the eyes, bright enough to chart the finest details of a candle's progress. Apprentices watched in stillness as the flame's base quivered, then steadied to a confident height. Master Corby bent forward, eyes narrowed, and noted the initial reading, 6¼ lines. No smoke. No swaying. Then the apprentices lit each of the evening's final tapers, those long, elegant candles poured that very afternoon. They stood in iron sconces along the north wall, spaced at regular intervals so that each flame had its own pool of air, unmolested by drafts from a half-open door or a shifting window latch. One apprentice moved across the room, adjusting the hearth's draft damper, allowing just so much cold night air to drift inward, imitating the gentle currents of an open chamber in a distant manner. The real work began. An apprentice stationed at a small desk lifted the master's leather-bound ledger, its pages edged with wax drips and speckled by charcoal smudges. In the margin beside each candle's entry, he prepared to record time and subtle deviations, rise and fall of the flame, any tendency to smoke, the precise moment when the wick might begin to curl. His quill hovered, ink shimmering in the lamplight, ready to transcribe observations that would guide future formulations. Minutes passed with near-monastic calm. Every 60 seconds, a soft cloth cushioned against a metal timer's bell. At each chime, eyes turned from writing to flame. One apprentice whispered measurement, candle 12, steady at 6 lines, slight flicker at 90 seconds. Another murmured, sample 15, flame leans quarter turn eastward, no soot. The low voices melted into the ambient hush, a rhythmic cadence, as if the workshop itself were breathing in perfect time. Between observations came the faintest of sounds, the teardrop of molten wax pooling at the base of a lamp, then cooling with a barely perceptible click. The scent of warm beeswax rose, mingling with the richer tang of tallow and the resinous hint of rosemary. An apprentice reached out, trailing a finger along a wax bead, before quickly wiping his hand on the corner of his apron to avoid contamination. These small interludes offered moments of sensory reprieve, a chance to feel the product they tested, to taste its promise of soft, reliable illumination in distant homes. As the hour grew late, the hearth's embers glowed faintly once more, but the lamplights maintained their vigil. The master paused by the iron door, listening to the muffled crunch of straw underfoot as the youngest apprentice crossed the room to pour a fresh measure of oil into a tray for later counting. The subdued activity served only to deepen the stillness, like the hush after a whispered prayer. Now came the final, crucial phase, endurance. Apprentices returned to each lamp, adjusting wick lengths by hair's breadth, ensuring the flame would neither drown in too much wick nor starve in too little. They looked for telltale ribbons of smoke, for any sign that the oil's purity or the wax's consistency might betray a weakness. More than once, a lamp exhibited the faintest dark wisp curling upwards. In that moment, the lamp was extinguished, the wick clipped, the candle set aside for remelting the next day. In the margins of the ledger, the apprentice wrote methodically, 6:40 p.m., sample 7 extinguished, 2 wisp coils of gray smoke, pull wick, recut to 3.8 millimeters. Letter by letter, verse by verse, the workshop's quiet hymn unfolded across parchment. There were no grand proclamations, only painstaking entries that would ensure each candle leaving these walls carried the promise of light as enduring as the craft itself. Finally, when the final sample had sustained its flame for the prescribed 10 minutes without falter, Master Corby stepped forward. With a slow nod, he acknowledged the success, the perfect taper, tested by lamp and ledger, ready to graduate from trial to parlor. The apprentices moved in choreographed unison to extinguish the lamps. A soft hiss followed each smothered wick, a small sigh that spoke of completion. One by one, the lamps yielded to the master's metal snuffer, and their faint heat lingered like a closing benediction. The workshop returned to darkness, save for the dying embers in the hearth. The ledger was closed with a gentle thud, its cover still warm to the touch. Quills were rinsed and laid out to dry, inkwells were sealed with beeswax stoppers to guard against spills overnight. Apprentices folded their aprons around the promising notes of the day and stepped back, awaiting Master Corby's departure. Under the faint glow of a lantern hung beside the oak door, the master paused. He placed a hand on the cool metal latch, feeling the lingering warmth of oil on his fingers. Through the window, starlight glimmered against the pitch-black sky, a reminder that every candle born in this workshop would soon meet the vast expanse of night. With a final glance at the silent benches and the neat row of extinguished lamps, he closed the door gently, sealing in the day's discoveries and the residue of quiet triumph. In the hush that followed, the craft itself seemed to breathe one last, contented whisper before sleep. Dusk's soft fingers slipped through the workshop's narrow window panes, painting the stone floor in muted gold. The hearth had quieted to glowing embers, and shaded oil lamps cast pools of gentle light along the long oak bench. This was the hour of final reckoning, when the day's labor of fire and wax would be measured and organized for its journey beyond these walls. Apprentices moved with a reverent hush, as if each footstep might disturb the carefully tested tapers waiting in neat rows. At the bench's center lay the master's most treasured tool, a small, hand-polished mirror framed in walnut, its surface unblemished and clear. It had been warmed by candlelight all afternoon, and now its glass held the faint glimmer of 100 tiny flames. One by one, the senior apprentice lifted a slender candle, tilting it against the reflecting pane. The act was deliberate and slow. Under this scrutiny, every imperfection, an air bubble trapped beneath the wax, a slight undulation in the taper's shaft, an off-center wick, revealed itself as clearly as stars on a cloudless night. The room was still except for the quiet scrape of trimmed wicks and the rustle of linen aprons. A soft tap against clay, where a small hammer broke off a flawed candle, echoed for a moment before fading into the cradle of evening air. Each discarded fragment spiraled down into a shallow earthenware bowl, its surface already mottled with flecks of solidified beeswax. Even in this rejection there was a gentle beauty, pale curls that resembled sea foam, the curved fragments that would be remelted and reborn in tomorrow's experiments. Once a candle passed inspection, it was placed into one of 3 rows, first quality, standard, and seconds. These designations were more than mere titles, they spoke of destinies. The first quality tapers, tall, slender, uniformly smooth, would find their way into parlors of well-heeled families eager for a flawless, soot-free glow. Those of standard grade might brighten tavern tables or modest studies, their small irregularities forgiven for the warmth they imparted. The seconds, nicked or slightly warped, were destined for the brazier in the workshop corner, where their brief life would lend extra heat to the simmering pots of new wax. Once sorted, the candles awaited the next ritual, bundling. Apprentices bent to pick up lengths of fine linen cord, its fibers soft between eager fingers. 3 tapers of matching size and finish were gathered together, their ends aligned on a gentle slope. Wrapping the cord around the slim bodies demanded a deft touch, too tight, and the wax would crack, too loose, and the bundle risked untimely separation. The cord was wound twice, then knotted with a simple hitch before the ends were trimmed to an exact half-inch. The loose strands fluttered like tiny pennants, signaling care and precision. Each bundle was laid on clean parchment, ready for the journey to the packing room. In one corner, the clay vessel of wax shavings had grown nearly full. The master approached it, his leather-bound ledger tucked under one arm. He dipped a slender spoon into the bowl, gathering the delicate curls. As he lifted them out, a soft crackle rose, then settled into stillness. He transferred the ribbons of waste wax into an earthenware jar, lining the inside with a thin sheet of oiled paper to ease future removal. The apprentices watched as he pressed the lid down, its clay rim bearing a small imprint of his fingertips. With a faint sigh, the jar sealed the day's cast-offs away, destined for the next cycle of melting. Nearby, another apprentice labeled each jar with charcoal strokes on a strip of parchment tied around its neck: lavender-scented scraps, pure beeswax rubbings, tallow shavings. In quiet unison, they arranged the vessels on a low shelf above a gently glowing brazier, already warming the remnants for an overnight remelt. The aroma of pine pitch and subtle floral undertones drifted upward, a soft reminder that even remnants carried the workshop's signature scents. The master closed the ledger with a slow breath. Today's tallies, numbers of tapers in each grade, total weight of wax repurposed, cords consumed, were inscribed with neat strokes of quill. He added a marginal note on a sample that had shown a slight droop at the base, to be revisited in tomorrow's trials. The ink still glistened. As he set down his pen, the last lamp flickered, and the apprentices took this as their cue to step back. For a final moment, the workshop stood in serene silence. The graded candles, tied and ready, waited in organized ranks. The jars of wax shavings gleamed dully in the lamplight. The ledger lay closed, its pages carrying another day's quiet discoveries. Beyond the window, night had fully fallen, and a single star shone over the slumbering village. In that hushed glow, the craft's gentle geometry, lines of tapering light, distilled scents, inked records, seemed suspended in time. So concluded Chapter 17's ritual of grading and sorting, a ceremony of exacting eyes and patient hands, where each candle's journey from molten wax to ordered bundle was acknowledged and set aside, ready for the steps that would follow. In the coming hours, the workshop would be cleaned and readied for tomorrow's dawn, but for now, this final procession of light stood testament to the day's measured triumphs, awaiting the rest that only sleep, and softer lamplight, could bring. The final glow of the late afternoon hearth had faded to a soft, dissipating warmth as the master signaled the end of the day's trials. A hush settled over the candle workshop, broken only by the gentle clink of metal tools resting on the rough-hewn oak bench and the soft scrape of desecrated wax being pried from tin molds. In this calm hour, work did not cease so much as it transformed. The same mindful attention devoted to blending waxes, trimming wicks, and recording burn durations now turned to clearing away every trace of today's experiments. The ritual of cleaning, so easily overlooked in modern retellings, was in truth a continuation of the craft itself, a practiced cadence of motions as precise and meaningful as any pour or ignition. Heating the water. By the hearth's edge, an apprentice bent to stoke the cooling embers under a small bronze cauldron. Each fresh coal was nestled gently among the glowing coals already alight, until a quiet roar rose beneath the vessel's broad belly. Soon, thin tendrils of steam began to curl upward from the water's surface, carrying the scent of soot and lingering beeswax. The bronze cauldron, rounded and pitted at its base from years of use, hummed with latent heat. As the water reached a gentle boil, the apprentice ladled a steady stream over the gnarled wooden handle of a wide-bladed soapstone scraper. Hot droplets sizzled where they met the old tool, softening any wax residue clinging to its edges. The steam brushed the apprentice's face, and in that warm mist, the first stage of cleansing had begun. Brushing workbenches and sweeping straw. While the water heated, another apprentice walked the length of the main workbench, a stiff-haired brush in hand. The bristles, worn to uneven lengths, carried away stray grains of sand from the day's mold pores and shattered fragments of brittle tallow. Each stroke released a faint rustle, like distant autumn wind through dry reeds. Underfoot, straw lay scattered from morning kneeling, pale lengths of chaff lifted in miniature dust clouds with each sweep of the short-handled broom. The apprentice paused at intervals to collect handfuls of straw in a leather pouch, kneeling on one straw-matted knee to peer closely at the wooden surface. In the pale light of a single brazier turned down low, every tiny wax splatter shimmered like glass before it was brushed away. The hush deepened as the bench grew bare and polished once more. Melting stray wax in the corner brazier. In the shadowed recess of the workshop, a corner brazier held embers from the earlier refining of tallow. Into this quiet hearth, small shards of discarded experimental wax were gathered, irregular slivers of beeswax tinted golden, flakes of tallow mottled gray, and even the remains of lavender-infused blends that had not met the master's scent standards. Each shard went into the brazier with a faint hiss and soft crackle, melting into a glossy pool. Apprentices moved in silence as if in reverence, stirring the molten glaze with a copper rod stolen from retired molds. The aroma of heated wax mingled with charred coal, weaving a comforting fragrance that spoke of transformation rather than waste. What once had marked failure in the day's ledger now assumed a new purpose, to be strained, stored, and reforged into tomorrow's experiments. Oiling hinges and wiping window panes. At the workshop's perimeter, heavy oak shutters stood ajar against the cooling dusk. Their wrought iron hinges, quiet all day long, now demanded attention. A small tin of linseed oil was passed from hand to hand, and with a clean strip of cloth, each hinge was oiled. The cloth soaked up the golden oil in rhythmic sweeps, the metal's surface brightening and loosening against the wood with a gentle thunk. Close by, window panes, grayed by hours of smoke, were wiped with distilled vinegar and soft linen rag. Apprentices moved methodically, one wiping, one following behind with a dry swath to catch drips and streaks. As the glass emerged clear, the pale evening light, blue-slivered and tender, entered the workshop once more, illuminating worktops now stripped clean of tools and waxy residue. Scraping molds and stowing utensils. Back at the melting table, molds cooled to room temperature, their innards solid and opaque. Using the warmed soapstone scraper, apprentices eased out every remnant of wax, guiding the tool along the mold's interior contour. Each scrape was deliberate, a metallic whisper at the lip, a soft thud as the last fragment fell free. The molds themselves, tin cylinders polished by years of careful handling, were then stacked in a wooden rack, molds nested within molds like tiers of diminutive castle towers. Spoons, ladles, and scissor blades were rinsed in the hot cauldron water, dried on linen cloths, and returned to leather straps on the wall. In this way, the workshop regained its pre-dawn simplicity, every implement in its place, every surface ready for the next day's dawn. Listening for residual sounds. As the apprentices moved through these tasks, a heightened awareness of silence permeated the room. The gentle drip of oily rag as hinges were wiped. The soft footfall of straw-laden slippers retreating to the corner brazier. The faint swirl of steam from the cauldron, now settling into idle warmth as it cooled. Even the lanterns overhead, with trimming performed and new wicks inserted, seemed to burn with a hushed steadiness, as though mindful of the approaching night. Students of the craft knew that this silence was not emptiness but a resting breath before the next cycle of creation. Reflecting on the day's work. While the tools dried and the hearth embers glowed faintly red, the apprentices allowed themselves a moment of reflection. Beside the hearth, a slender taper, one of the day's premium samples, burned with quiet confidence. Its flame rose straight and true, casting winking patterns on the walls. In its amber halo, the young apprentices saw the arc of the morning's trials, the first melting of beeswax, the experiments in wick thickness, the subtle infusions of lavender, and finally the careful grading of tapers for parlors and studies. Now, as they aligned brushes and returned folders of field notes to their shelves, they recognized that even the act of cleaning was an integral part of the candlemaker's tradition. A spotless bench made for better pours, an oiled hinge kept shutters easily open at dawn, a scraped mold guaranteed the purity of the next melt. Preparing for tomorrow. With the final scrap of stray wax scraped into a lidded jar and the last window pane clear enough to catch the moon's silver edge, the master gave a quiet nod. The apprentices closed the cauldron's lid, cut coal from the corner brazier to embers no greater than glowing coals, and carefully raked the ashes into an iron pan. The workshop, at once transformed from the flurry of experiments to a sanctuary of order, now awaited night's true dominion. Tomorrow's dawn would call for the stirring of embers once again, but for now, the ritual of closure was complete. In the stillness that followed, the apprentices lingered only a moment, brushing hands on worn aprons, adjusting stockings, striding softly toward the heavy oak door. The last candle in the brazier hissed like a slow exhalation, its wick drooping as flame turned to smoke. Beyond the shuttered windows, the street lay hushed under a sky of muted indigo. Within the workshop, every tool, every bench, every pane of glass stood ready for the morrow's quiet rituals. And in that readiness, the promise of another day's gentle alchemy glowed more brightly than any candle flame. The workshop's lamplight had dimmed to a soft, tremulous glow by the time the master drew his stool to the worn oak bench. Outside, evening had fallen fully. The last test candle, set alight only moments earlier, offered the soul-living brightness within the shadowed walls. Its flame danced gently, swallowing each sly puff of air that drifted through the loosely fitted boards of the window frame. The apprentices, their faces faintly illuminated, lingered at the far end of the room, hushed into reverent silence, as though the very hush might preserve the fragile remnants of daylight. A single, slender volume lay open before the master, a ledger swollen with parchment pages, each one inscribed in brown ink with the day's meticulous observations. Lines of numbers and terse annotations curved like a river of data across the spread, recording every softly measured detail, burn times, flicker steadiness, soot accumulation, the slightest aroma detected at successive intervals. Every candle trial, from the weight of its initial pour to the subtle taper at its base, had been diligently transcribed here. Now, as the last candle's wick glowed low, the master raised his quill one final time and inched it across the page, noting with a steady hand the precise moment when the flame softened into a faint blur. He set the quill aside, its nib still glistening with leftover ink, and reached to draw the brass cap over the nearest ink well. There was a faint click as the lid snapped shut, sealing away the dark liquid within. The gesture felt both emphatic and ceremonial. For in this simple act, closing the ink well, he marked the end of one cycle of inquiry and the silent promise of another to come. With deliberate care, he folded the quill's feathers in gentle repose and laid it next to the ink well, its barbs aligned as though in salute. The apprentices watched him, shoulders easing as they exchanged a glance of satisfaction, another day's work enshrined. Beyond the bench, molds were stacked neatly, tools hung in order on the rough-hewn pegboard, and stray fragments of cooled wax lay collected in a small copper brazier, still emitting the faintest trace of beeswax warmth. Leaning forward, the master traced his finger along the top margin of the open ledger, where he had earlier inscribed an outline of lingering questions. Would a half-drop increase in powdered resin further reduce soot? Should the rush wicks be retested with a coarser twist, or should the linen variants suffice for evening tapers? Could a touch more stearin lend a steadier edge to the glow without altering the candle's subtle hue? These inquiries, jotted in neat Latin on the uppermost parchment, would guide the trials of tomorrow, and perhaps the morrow after that. He let his gaze drift momentarily upward, toward the high rafters where the thin ribbon of smoke from the brazier curled against the dark beams. The hush felt pregnant with anticipation. Setting down a leather strap, he closed the ledger's heavy covers and clicked the brass clasp into place. The sound resonated softly through the room, quelling the oily whisper of settling cloth and the distant echo of a church bell drifting in from the lane beyond. Each clasp reminded him of the slumbering knowledge within the folio's depths, tried-and-true recipes from previous masters, marginal notes that traced the evolution of candlecraft over decades, even centuries. These were the voices of the past, preserved in each yellowed page and awaiting resurrection by the next in line. He reached to his right and lifted a separate folio, an older, more venerable volume bound in rich calfskin, its edges reinforced with brass corners. The spine was cracked with age, its pages mottled by time. Carefully, he sent it sliding into the shallow drawer of a small chest, its brass hinges glinting dimly. With one final glance at the ledger, now resting closed and sealed upon the bench, he tucked the quill beneath the leather strap that bound it, as though protecting the tool that had drawn every letter of the day's revelations. Behind him, the apprentices took a step forward to help. One extinguished the brazier's remaining embers with a scattering of fine sawdust, the ash smothering the last orange glow. Another swept the bench's surface with a horsehair brush, capturing any dust of wax that might remain. The air, once thick with honeyed fragrance and the faint tang of smoldering wick, grew cool and still, the journaled aromas drifting back to the hearth, which had already been banked for the night. The master rose slowly, stretching the leather of his elbows patches. He paused by the window, where the glass pane bore a thin film of condensation from the day's warmth now vanishing into the chill outdoors. With a practiced swipe of his woolen cuff, he cleared the glass just enough to glimpse the deserted street below, lit only by a distant lantern swinging in the breeze. In that gentle luminance he saw the promise of another rising sun, another day of molding, trimming, dripping, and recording. He inhaled deeply, the crisp air carrying a memory of pollen from early spring and the faint scent of wet stone. Returning to the bench, he set a final object into place, a tapered stick of chalk, its point worn from earlier marks on a nearby board where he had sketched proportions and hastily noted an idea for a future trial. The chalk joined the bench's small assembly of compass, snips, and spoons, tools that would lie dormant until dawn. But for tonight, they stood in quiet testament to the craftsman's method, a slow, deliberate unraveling of wax and wick that, drop by drop, flame by flame, had illuminated the pages of history and the chambers of each home in town. At last, the master gathered his coat from its peg and reached for his lantern, its wick already trimmed and tested in the late afternoon's final essays. He lifted it, and the amber globe caught the last reflection of the workshop's brass accents before he turned away. The apprentices, respectful of the moment, offered a silent nod as he crossed toward the door. There remained one last duty, ensuring the ledger and the folio were tucked safely away. With a soft click, the door's latch fell into place behind him, sealing in the quiet knowledge of the day's labors and leaving the candles to rest until the morrow's first light. The hush that settles after the last candle blade is snuffed feels almost sacred. In the dim corner of the workshop, the final lamp's wick surrenders to the master's steady breath. A soft, lingering hiss echoes through the rafters, an echo of all the firelight that has guided the day's careful toil. For a moment, the room seems suspended between flame and darkness, as if time itself pauses to honor the work of beeswax and tallow, wick and mold, ink and parchment. The apprentices have long since departed, their straw-strewn footprints fading into the cold stone floor. Only the master remains, reverently straightening the quill that rests atop the day's ledger, its inky tip still glistening faintly beneath the shuttered window. He moves slowly, aware of every footfall, as if reluctant to disturb the calm that blankets the chamber. Each tool, snips, spoon, ladle, has been cleaned and laid in its rack. The copper kettles and overseer's brazier stand cool now, their once gleaming surfaces speckled with hardened droplets of wax. Even the brass-bound folio of old recipes has been closed, its leather hide gently clasped to protect the wisdom it holds for another dawn. In the pale glow of a single residual smolder, the master reaches for the heavy oak door. The latch resists for a heartbeat, then yields with a quiet rasp. He steps across the threshold, closing it behind him against the chill of night. Outside, the air is crisp and still. The narrow cobblestone lane lies silent, its uneven stones bathed in silver moonlight. A distant church tower stands dark against the sky, its bells at rest until the next matins. The master pauses, hand pressed lightly to the door's iron-bound arch. He breathes in the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from neighbors' hearths, mingled with the residual honeyed perfume of spent beeswax. All through the day, this aroma was loyal companion to each trial pour and every whispered notation. Now it drifts free into the night, like the last line of a soft lullaby. He allows his gaze to lift, tracing the arches of the heavens above. Stars glimmer in silent congregation, each one a flickering flame that once guided sailors and shepherds alike. The master feels a kinship with those distant lights, steady, enduring, luminous amidst vast darkness. So too is the humble candle, a small promise of warmth, an intimate beacon against the encroaching gloom. In those measured hours from dawn to dusk, he and his apprentices coaxed molten wax to life, shaped slender pillars of light that would soon comfort others, in parlors softly lit for evening conversation, in taverns where laughter danced among shadows, in solitary studies where letters by candle glow carried secret hope. He recalls the gentle crackle of imperfect samples as they were broken apart, the soft drip of surplus wax into the spoil brazier, and the careful tallying of flame height, flicker, and soot. Each data point found its place beside another, until the ledger brimmed with insights born of quiet repetition. In the quiet of today's final moments, those meticulous notations feel like whispered confidences exchanged between craft and crafter. They promise a new chapter tomorrow, further blends to test, fresh wicks to refine, and yet more understanding to glean from the unhurried ritual. The master's fingers brush against the cold iron of the workshop's hinges as he turns back toward the door. Inside awaits the pale glow of dawn's first embers, waiting to be nudged to life by an apprentice's gentle hand. He feels the weight of responsibility, this ancient trade entrusted to each generation, guided by fading diaries and the delicate rule of thumb. Outside, the breeze stirs the soft thatch on nearby rooftops, and the quiet murmur of night insects hums a lullaby for the sleeping hamlet. A lone owl calls, its note resonant and distant, as if to punctuate the end of day's labor and herald the restful promise of night. Taking one last, lingering look at the star-strewn sky, the master closes his eyes. He listens to the echoes of labor, the measured drip of molten wax, the whisper of quill on parchment, the faint warmth of the latest taper winking out. He lets these sounds sink into memory, carrying them forward as both guide and comfort. Then, with a final deep breath, he turns the key in the lock, securing the workshop against the cool hush of midnight. The oak door closes, muffling the world within its walls, and the workshop rests in darkness until the first hesitant glow of dawn invites life once more. Tonight, the candles are gone, their work complete. Yet in the slumbering stillness of the small town, beyond the shuttered windowpanes and through silent streets, the memory of their gentle light endures, an unspoken promise that tomorrow will bring fresh rituals, renewed focus, and the timeless wonder of humble flames. And as the master walks away, each step carries him deeper into the hush of night, where dreams are woven in shadows and the next day's craft awaits in patient silence.